totally wrong facts that people still believe. The flat earth fallacy. Okay, we all know that the earth is flat, right? I'm obviously joking, and I'll save the tinfoil hat for another day. But what I'm referring to isn't flat earthers in the modern day, but it's the flat earth belief that was held by people in the Middle Ages, specifically around the time when Christopher Columbus took his infamous journey across the ocean. Obviously, during the Middle Ages, it was believed that the earth was flat and that if you were to sail too far in the wrong way in the ocean, you could literally fall off the earth. And it was for this reason that Christopher Columbus wanted to prove these people wrong and risked his life sailing the opposite way to India to prove that the earth was round and not flat, going against the primary belief at that time. Now, what if I told you that everything you just heard about that situation is not true whatsoever? It is actually a rather popular misconception. Let me explain. While Christopher Columbus did sail across the ocean to prove a point, the point he was not trying to prove was that the earth wasn't flat. The point he was trying to prove was that the earth wasn't as big as some people suspected. It is historical fact that not only Christopher Columbus, but basically any educated individual during the 1400s knew that the earth wasn't flat and was in fact round. And this knowledge dates back far before Christopher Columbus or even the Middle Ages entirely. Some of the first recorded suggestions that the earth may be round actually date all the way back to the 6th century BC with the Greek philosopher Pythagoras. And later in the 4th century BC, Aristotle even agreed and supported this theory, citing one personal observation that he noticed every time he traveled southward, southern constellations would be higher in the sky. But this, of course, wasn't the only evidence we had of the Earth being round. During this time, we also had recorded observations of lunar eclipses showing a round shadow on the moon from Earth, and of course, numerous eyewitness accounts of mountains seemingly growing out of the ground on the horizon as you approach them, or seeing a ship seemingly submerge into the water as it sails into the ocean. My point is that we've had a lot of evidence that the Earth is round, and it dates back far, like way before the Middle Ages and even way before the Common Era. But just to further validate this point, in the 3rd century BC, it wasn't just a suggestion that the Earth may be round. At this point, it was basically a known fact to anybody in the educated community. And philosophers and scientists were not so much focused on the shape of the Earth, but the size of the Earth. And potentially, most impressively, at this time, the head librarian of the Library of Alexandria, Eratosthenes, was able to estimate the circumference of the Earth with 99% accuracy. And while that estimate wasn't proven to be extremely accurate until much later, it still goes to show that there is a lot of evidence suggesting that not only was the world not flat very long ago, but that people were well aware that the Earth was not flat. Which brings us back to our original point. No, Christopher Columbus did not think that he was potentially going to fall off the world, and nobody who was educated or even slightly paying attention thought that either. And while seemingly flat earthers have existed in every era of history, they're as ridiculous today as they were back in 1492. So, what was the point of this entire expedition? Well, like I mentioned earlier, Columbus didn't believe the mainstream theory of how big the Earth was. And his goal, with the support from Queen Elizabeth, was not to prove that the Earth was round or not to see what was beyond the edge of the Earth, but to potentially find a more quick and efficient trade route between Europe and Asia to optimize international trade. And of course, we all know what happened from there on out, and well, here we are. So yeah, the suggestions from people in the Middle Ages believing the Earth was flat are actually modern misinformation, with this myth being brought to the mainstream in the 1700s and 1800s. And unfortunately today, stick figures on the internet still need to undo all of this misinformation. But in case you wanted a real misconception that was believed during the Middle Ages, I'll give you one. A lot of people during this time suspected that the sun rotated around the Earth. That was until Nicholas Copernicus came around and suggested that maybe the Earth rotated around our sun. And he did so not with observable evidence, but with a mathematical model that was not only hard to argue, but was eventually proven true. The Mount Everest myth. If learning that the Earth is actually round blew your mind, then this is about to shatter it. Everybody and their grandmother's grandmother knows that Mount Everest is by far the tallest mountain in the entire world. But what if I told you that actually wasn't the case? Now, before you think I'm lying, let me just confirm that yes, Mount Everest has the highest peak above sea level in the entire world. The peak of Mount Everest is 29,029 feet above sea level, and it is confirmed the tallest peak around the globe. But what if I told you that there was another mountain that was technically taller? If you're confused, don't worry, because I'm about to make it all make sense. Introducing Mauna Kea, a dormant volcano on the island of Hawaii. Looking at this mountain, it's relatively impressive, but only stands at roughly 13,800 feet above sea level, meaning that it's tall, but it's obviously not taller than Mount Everest. That is, unless you measured from base to peak. And this is where this technicality comes into play, because Mauna Kea is kind of like an iceberg, and there's a lot more than meets the eye. Specifically, the 20,000 feet of mountain that exists under the ocean. That's right, unlike Mount Everest, the base of Mauna Kea is submerged deep underwater. And it's for that reason that while from base to tip, it is technically 4,000 feet taller than Mount Everest due to the fact that most of it is actually underwater, it will unfortunately never claim the title of tallest mountain simply because it has a pretty significant disadvantage of existing in an ocean. It's almost like you were 6'5" and you went to a tall guy competition, but in order to compete, you had to stand in a 5-inch hole, meaning that you were only 6 foot. And while the person you were competing was standing on flat ground and was only 6'1" tall, well, guess what? This other guy is technically taller than you, even if you have a few inches underground. But I have a feeling this one might be a bit controversial, so let me know what you think. Does anything below sea level not count, even if it is part of the mountain's base? Or is Mauna Kea an underdog that deserves more attention? Because realistically, base to tip, it is the tallest mountain in the entire world. I'll let you guys duke it out in the comments, but if you ever want to be the most annoying person in the world, next time you hear somebody claim that Mount Everest is the tallest mountain in the world, make sure to confidently and rudely tell them, no, actually, Mount Everest has the tallest peak in the world, but Mauna Kea is the tallest base to tip. And in case that doesn't kill the mood at the party, well, then just tell them how much you hate pineapple on pizza, because those people are annoying too. The hot-headed hoax. One experience I had when I was younger that I think we all share is the experience of being a kid and not wanting to wear a coat. There was just so many times where it was cold out, but I didn't want to wear a coat. I had no logical explanation, I just didn't feel like wearing that restrictive device. But every single time, Mama Bro made me wear my coat and we went about our day. But it wasn't always a coat I was apprehensive to wear. Sometimes it was hats and gloves. Which brings me to the myth at play. My mom used to tell me that you have to wear a hat when it's cold out because 80% of the heat from your body leaves through your head. And for that reason, you need to insulate it to ensure you are fully warm. And I know for a fact, my mom wasn't the only person to say that. And if I was a betting man, I would say that your mom probably did too. But whether it was a family member or a loved one or a friend or even just a news article, the reality is this. Your head is not some elusive chimney that is dead set on lowering your body's core temperature. But before we use facts to completely debunk this myth, let's actually trace back the origins of it. And it's not that long ago. The most commonly accepted origin of this myth dates back to the 1970s in a US Army survival manual, where in that survival manual, it claims that covering your head is a necessity in the cold because, quote, 40 to 45% of body heat is lost from the head. And while you think a US Army survival manual would be a relatively reputable source for this sort of information, this is one thing they got wrong. But at this point, you might be asking yourself, where did they even get this number or this theory? How did they come up with 40 to 45% of your body heat being lost through your head? And well, those roots date back to the 1950s, where the US military was doing tests on volunteers dressed in Arctic survival suits and were exposed to bitterly cold conditions. And the point of this test was to see where the body was losing most heat in these suits to better help optimize them. And during this flawed analysis, one thing that the scientists realized was that, most of the body heat in these volunteers is being lost through their head. But as you can see, these Arctic survival suits do not include hats, meaning that logically the head would lose the most heat, not because it is some crazy part of the body, it's just the fact that the head was not covered. And scientists who went back to analyze this data have even been recorded to say, quote, if the experiment had been performed with people only wearing swim trunks, then they would have lost no more than 10% of the heat through their heads. And it's almost hard to believe that such a simple seeming logical fallacy would exist in such a professional place, a literal military survival test. But I suppose this one was overlooked because, yeah, if your entire body is insulated and only your head is exposed to the elements, your head definitely will lose the most amount of heat. Not because your head is vulnerable, but because the head was the only part that was literally exposed to the elements. So here's the facts. While it may seem logical that your head may be more vulnerable because of the lack of fat and the abundance of blood vessels, the reality is that heat escapes from all parts of the human body at a similar rate per square inch. And while in your own personal experience, it may seem like your head is the primary source of your heat loss in cold weather, as we saw in the military test, it's not necessarily because your head is extra vulnerable, it's because typically your head is the least insulated with clothing. So yeah, is it a good idea to wear a hat or a toque on a cold day? Definitely. But is it because your head loses much more heat than the rest of your body? No, your head is just more vulnerable because most people aren't wearing toques all the time. And even if you are wearing a toque, it's very unlikely that you're insulating your head like you're insulating your chest, because you could put on a coat and insulate your entire torso. But unless you're wearing a balaclava and ski goggles, your head is always going to be less insulated. Not biologically, but by choice. The cold conundrum. Okay, since we're already on the topic of cold weather and stuff your mom told you, I figured this would be the perfect follow-up. And the follow-up in question is the interesting fact that you can get sick from being exposed to the cold. Logically, it makes sense. It's called a cold, you get it from being cold. What else is there to question? That is logical fact. But what if I was to be so bold to suggest that it wasn't the cold weather that was directly causing flu season to affect people? And I know it may sound blasphemous to your grandmother, but going outside without a hat or with wet hair isn't going to cause you to catch pneumonia. So what's the real scoop? Well, for starters, it's proven that you can't get an infectious or viral disease simply from being exposed to cold temperatures. However, you can get hypothermia, but that's different. So why do seemingly so many people catch colds or the flu as soon as the seasons start to change? There has to be something to it. And the fact of the matter is, there is something to it, but it's a lot more than meets the eye. You see, just because you don't develop a flu upon first contact with a cool breeze doesn't mean that there's not factors at play that cause the typical flu season. And while temperatures getting cooler may be the most obvious and seemingly guilty culprit, it's really one of the least. And some of the more unlikely culprits are the following. Firstly, reduced vitamin D levels, because as winter approaches, people are spending less time outside, the sun is seen less in most parts of the world, and as a result, your vitamin D levels are below what they should be. On top of this, during cooler months, overall air humidity is lowered, and it has been proven that lower humidity can increase your risk of rhinoviruses. And thirdly, rhinoviruses are typically spread through direct person-to-person contact, or by inhaling small droplets in the air, which is gross. But these things can only take place when you're coming in contact with people, typically in an enclosed environment. And during colder months, we typically spend more time inside, meaning that there's more risk of exposure. And when you combine all three of these factors all happening at the same time, it's not really hard to understand how more people could be more susceptible to diseases at a certain time of year, regardless of the outside temperature. So to settle the debate once and for all, does direct cold exposure cause you to get sick? No. But does every aspect of winter covertly try to get you sick? I would say yes. Meaning that just because you're safe from a cold breeze doesn't mean you're safe from a cold. Bubblegum bewilderment. Okay, admittedly, this entry is a bit less serious, but I think it's definitely the most universal, and call it a playground fact if you will, because I believe that almost everybody watching this video either believed or at least heard of this next fact, which is that if you swallow chewing gum, it will stay in your stomach for 7 years. Or, some variation of that. And if you've ever heard this, well, I'm about to give you the full scoop. And if you still believe this, well, I'm about to blow your mind. Obviously, because I'm talking about this in this video, the gum does not stay in your body for 7 years. It actually stays in your digestive system for over 20 years. That is a joke. It does not at all. You see, it is true that gum is indigestible. Your body can simply not break it down and process it. But that does not mean that your body can't pass it through. And believe it or not, you probably eat a lot of things that your body can simply not digest. And if you don't believe me, well, two popular examples are corn and sunflower seeds. And don't even get me started on indigestible fibers. Keep in mind, your body is resilient. And just imagine all of the stuff that our ancient stomachs had to deal with. And just think about all the things your body had to deal with when you were a kid. Swallowing Lego and eating Polly Pocket pieces. Or possibly even shoving those light bright things up your nose. Regardless, your body in one way or another is able to deal with pretty interesting situations. It is for that reason that gum in your digestive tract, at least on rare occasions, is not a concern. But it does in fact differ from standard digestion. Let me explain. In the context of normal food items, there is a 3-step process that every food must go through before it can be digested. First, your food must be, of course, chewed. And this chewing process not only breaks down food, but also increases its surface area, which is directly beneficial for the next step of the process, which is actually executed by your saliva. Your saliva covers these small pieces of food, and with its now increased surface area, your saliva's enzymes are able to break it down even further. And once the food is properly chewed and salivated, it is then sent to your stomach for the final stage of processing, where your stomach acid turns all of your food into a smooth mush that your digestive tract can easily pass through and absorb nutrients out of. And while this is the process for most foods, gum does not play by these rules at all. For starters, you can chew gum all day long, and the breakdown it's going to experience is minimal. And the vast majority of people will spit out their gum before it'll ever begin to break down into smaller pieces. But even if you did intentionally chew your gum into smaller pieces, it's not going to affect what happens in the next 2 stages. You see, chewing gum is made out of both natural and synthetic polymers. And it's for this reason that the gum cannot be broken down by either your saliva or your stomach acid. And that's honestly a good thing, because if your body was able to break down the polymers for your digestive tract to absorb it, you would get very sick. So be grateful it's kind of immune to those processes. But regardless, now that you have intact gum, not only in your stomach, but now in your digestive tract, what happens? Well, like any other food product, it'll slowly make its way through your digestive system, potentially getting caught up on the way, but eventually getting its way out, typically in 1 to 2 days. Although gum can be sticky, your body is designed to get rid of even the most stubborn of foods, and that includes chewing gum. But I will say this, even though chewing gum won't stay in your stomach for 7 years like you might have thought on the playground, it's not recommended that you start swallowing it en masse. And that's because if you do swallow enough chewing gum, you can develop something that's known as a bezoar, which is just essentially a blockage in your digestive tract, which can be painful, dangerous, and even deadly if left untreated. So no, chewing gum does not stay in your body for numerous years, although it's not recommended you try it for yourself. The chameleon con. I'm about to take you on an emotional roller coaster, but spoiler alert, it has a happy ending, so buckle up. We all know that chameleons can change color. That is their claim to fame, and I am not going to take that from them. That is an undisputed fact. But the thing that I will dispute is the fact that they do this for camouflage purposes. In almost every cartoon and TV chameleon we see, they are specifically changing their colors to blend into a specific environment. And while this is a neat party trick and a logical survival instinct, this is actually not what's going on in most cases. But before I describe exactly why chameleons actually change color, I want to describe exactly how they change color, because this process is amazing. You see, in the skin of a chameleon, it has what is known as pigment cells. Pigment cells aren't necessarily rare in the animal kingdom, and there are certain animals that can even control them, such as squids and cuttlefish. Those animals actually have small muscles that can expand or contract these pigment cells to change their color. However, that's not how the chameleon changes its colors. It has these pigment cells, but it can't control them. Now, interestingly, between these pigment cells, chameleons have separate cells that have darker melanin pigment, and these cells specifically can be controlled by the chameleon. And how this works is really quite astonishing. These melanin pigment cells basically expand or contract across the surface of the skin to either darken or lighten the skin of the chameleon. And this works completely separately from the default pigment cells that are already on the skin. Chameleons aren't the only animal that do this process either. There's a fish known as the tilapia fish that also has this same method of color changing. And you can see on this close-up video exactly how it works in real time, and it is so crazy. Seeing it side by side on a visual level and on a cellular level is so interesting. But we're still not done yet, because on top of the pigment cells that already exist and the melanin pigment cells that the chameleon can control, the chameleon also has tiny crystals in its skin that reflect light. And by seemingly some miracle, the chameleons can control exactly how far these crystals are from each other within its own skin. And the distance that these crystals are from each other directly determine the type of light that is reflected off the chameleon's skin. And now that we know the three primary tools in a chameleon's tool belt when it comes to changing color, how does this look in real time? Because I think most of us have a falsified idea of how this even looks. Here's a side-by-side video of a fake chameleon change and a real chameleon change. As you can see, the real is a little bit slower and a lot less dramatic, but still amazing nonetheless. But to go back to the original point of this section, if chameleons don't change their color for camouflage, why do they change their color at all? And sometimes fact is stranger than fiction, because chameleons are basically nature's mood ring. And scientists are pretty certain that in most cases, the only reason that chameleons are changing color are to better express their emotions to potential mates or to potential predators. And scientists even have their own theories on what each color means, which I'll go through right now. It's believed that when chameleons are extremely bright and colorful, they are at their most excited. And this could mean excited about a potential fight or excited about a potential mating session. I said mating session. When chameleons are typically darker, it's believed they are feeling more submissive or relaxed, for a less sensual word. But yeah, chameleons are cool, cute, cuddly. Some of them even have horns, but what you've been told about them is a lie. And it's believed that in the vast majority of cases, chameleons don't change color to blend in, they're changing color to better express themselves, which I think is an even cooler reality than what's portrayed in movies. But that's just my opinion. The subscriber scam. I think that one common fact most people believe is that if somebody's watching your video, they're probably subscribed to you. But I'm here to tell you that that fact is completely wrong. And I've got the facts to prove it. YouTube tells me that nearly 75% of people watching my videos are not even subscribed, which is a crazy statistic. So if you've been watching my videos and you enjoy them, feel free to hit the subscribe button. And if you need a reason to subscribe and you're not already, look at the subscribe button while I say, subscribe to Trust Me Bro. If that doesn't blow your mind, I don't know what will. But now let's get to our next serious section, the fortune cookie falsehood. Growing up, getting Chinese food was a special occasion, and it was truly one of my favorite special meals. And out of the entire seemingly endless spread that we would order from these Chinese food places, my favorite part of the meal was always the fortune cookie. Obviously a staple in Chinese cuisine, and a long-lasting tradition in Chinese culture, right? The fortune cookie, always served in Chinese restaurants, has to be Chinese. It would make no sense any other way, right? And while I agree with that hypothesis, I'm sorry to tell you, but that is not the truth. The fortune cookies that you and I get in modern day Chinese food have almost nothing to do with China whatsoever. And ironically, when the whole fortune cookie craze took over the Western world, companies tried selling fortune cookies in China, marketing them as an American treat, but they were taken off shelves because nobody was interested in them. And I genuinely don't think you can get more ironic than that. But if the paper and cookie tradition doesn't come from China and the cookie doesn't come from China, then who came up with these crazy cookies and why do they sell them at Chinese food spots? Well, I'm gonna answer both of those questions. But to be totally transparent, there is no definitive historical source of Chinese fortune cookies. All we have is some more modern accounts and some historical speculation, with the most proven and accepted theory being that Chinese fortune cookies actually originate in Japan. One of the only historical records of modern-day Chinese fortune cookies exist in illustrations from 19th century Japan, and these illustrations show a treat known as Sujiura Senbei. But these illustrations aren't just a relic from the past, because to this day you can buy this treat handmade on the streets of Kyoto. And how they make it is the following. Bakers will use iron molds, will grill the dough to a medium firm consistency, and then they will fold this dough into something they call small waffles. And it's during this folding process where they will insert a piece of paper with the fortune and give it its classic curved shape. But admittedly, this Japanese version and the Western version you and I are likely used to eating are not the same. With Sujiura Senbei, for example, they are larger, darker, and savory. Whereas in the American version, they are sweeter, smaller, and lighter in texture because they are using butter instead of miso in the baking process. But while that is interesting and insightful, it still doesn't answer the question, how did this get into Chinese restaurants in America? And well, the answer is immigration and adaptability. During the 1910s, a lot of Japanese immigrants were landing in California. And with them, they brought their culture, specifically Sujiura Senbei. And while that logically explains why these fortune cookies are in America, why are they in Chinese restaurants? And while this isn't definitively proven, the most commonly accepted answer as of now is a result of Asian fusion food restaurants and America's early on disdain for Japanese food. And what I mean by this is, in the 1910s, a lot of Japanese immigrants were struggling to open authentic Japanese restaurants, specifically because Americans were not too fond of eating raw fish. And because of this, these Japanese entrepreneurs decided that their best next steps were to create Chinese food restaurants, tailoring the dishes to the American palate, specifically giving a sweet treat at the end of a meal. Hence why the American fortune cookie is sweet and the Japanese version is, well, not. I saved this entry for the end of the video because technically it's not fact. There is a lot of working theories about all of the specific origins, and there is not one definitive historical account start to finish of the entire history of fortune cookies. However, what I've told you today is most commonly the accepted version of events. However, you could argue it's not fully known. And well, that's accurate. But I honestly just think the entire history of fortune cookies is just so interesting because it was a Japanese tradition that was brought to America, was extremely popular in America, was brought to China, and failed in China, which is, I don't know, ironic and worth mentioning. Common scams everyone still falls for. The printer ink plot. Let me know if this sounds familiar. It's back to school season and you need a printer. You've got homework, projects, and lots of things that you need to print out, and for that reason, you're going to BroBuy to buy a printer. Luckily for you, there is tons of back-to-school sales, and you find the perfect printer for you for only $50. This printer looks solid, comes from a reputable brand, and even comes with ink. And although it was originally $100, for you, today it's $50. You buy this printer from BroBuy, you go back to your dorm room, and as the school semester begins, you realize your ink begins to get low. Obviously, ink is a consumable item, so you understand you have to replace it eventually, but this seems a bit quick. Regardless, you go back to BroBuy and begin to find the perfect ink replacement. Now, the first thing that's not really a scam, but is definitely irritating, is the crazy naming structure of ink cartridges. Like, if you somehow forgot to bring the Rosetta Stone to the printer ink section of BroBuy, you're gonna go home empty-handed or with ink that's not gonna fit your printer. Regardless, assuming you know exactly what you're looking for, you find this printer ink was not so much of a deal. The printer you bought only a month ago was $50, but this printer ink is $55. Obviously, this has to be a mistake, and you go to ask the employee if this is right, and they tell you, yeah, printer ink is expensive, it's hard to manufacture, blah, 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 blah. And you, being clever, decide that, well, if the ink is more, I'm just gonna buy another printer. But you go to the printer section only to realize that the printer is no longer on sale. And your options now are a $100 full price printer or $55 ink. And you take the $55 ink cartridge to the cash register, you check out, and you head home. If this sounds even remotely familiar to you, then I'm sorry to tell you, you have been scammed. Considering it's 2025, I would definitely say that most people are privy to the fact that printer ink cartridges are a scam. However, I would argue that most people are still oblivious to the fact of exactly how deep this scam runs, which is why this entry is on this list, and I'm going to expose the scam even further. To lay the foundation, the general business model of ink cartridge printers essentially goes like this. These companies produce a relatively quality printer, typically selling them with very thin margins or even sometimes at a loss, knowing that the real money is going to be made on the back end with their ink. And they ensure this back end business in multiple ways. The first method that these brands use is creating a proprietary ink cartridge that only works with their printers. This ensures that the consumer is not buying ink from other big brands or even smaller third parties that could give a better deal, meaning that the person who bought the cheap printer is now locked into their overpriced ink. But of course, it doesn't stop there. So now that we have a basic understanding of the bait and switch tactics that printer companies use to sell cheap printers but expensive ink, how else are they actually scamming you? Well, for starters, the cartridges that you are buying are basically empty. There are tons of videos online of people cracking open these ink cartridges only for them to be filled with foam and drops of ink. Literally drops. According to some of the YouTube videos I saw, these ink cartridges claimed to have 11 milliliters of ink, but actually only contained 3 milliliters of usable ink, which is ridiculous if you keep in mind the fact that you're paying anywhere from $10 to $50 for this ink. Those are some pretty expensive milliliters. Not only are these printer companies forcing you to buy their cartridges and forcing you to pay egregious prices for minimal ink, these printers are also wasting this precious ink that you spent your hard-earned money on. No, literally, let's say that you want to print a full-page document in just black. Regardless of what you choose, your printer is still going to use black and color ink just because. Now, some people claim that the reason that printers do this is to ensure that your black is as vibrant and as rich as it could be. However, a YouTuber by the name of Fstoppers tested this, and he printed out a document in black, and then he printed another document in black, but he covered the tip of the color cartridge to see if there was a difference. And what he was able to confirm was both documents looked the exact same, meaning that the colored ink with the black ink made no difference in the final product, meaning that the printer is literally wasting your colored ink even on fully black prints. So while the printer companies say they're just enhancing your black with a little bit of blue or a little bit of pink, the reality is you cannot say no to this option and use only your black ink. And if you can't even say no to this function, to me, that's a scam. But once again, it doesn't end there. Not only are printers wasting your ink by adding colors you don't need to black prints, most cartridge printers go through something known as a cleaning cycle. And these typically occur either every time the printer is turned on or every time the printer prints something. And at a surface level, this makes sense. A printer is using a very fine tip to deliver a very precise amount of ink on a paper without having it bleed or smear. So for that reason, having a clean printer ink tip makes sense. However, this cleaning cycle is extremely wasteful. And not only does it just clean the tip of the cartridge, but in some cases, this cleaning cycle causes ink to come out of the cartridge and over time typically results in half of the ink cartridge being wasted just on this cleaning cycle. You can't tell me that's not at least a bit intentional, or at least hasn't been fixed for a reason. Oh, and don't even get me started on trying to refill these cartridges because, well, first of all, you literally can't even open them, and if you try to, there's an extremely high chance that your printer will just reject the tampered with cartridge to begin with. I've been talking about printers way too much, and we have a lot of ground to cover in this video. Oh, don't even get me started on the environmental aspect of all of the wasted cartridges and all of the toxic ink. That's a whole different disaster. The diamond disaster. Similar to the ink cartridge scam, I think that in this day and age, most people are privy to the fact that diamonds are not as rare as they say, and the market is for the most part propped up by manipulation and lies. And while I could make an entire video about the sheer depravity of the diamond industry, covering topics like forced child labor and market manipulation, however, for the purpose of this video, I'm going to focus on one specific subset of the diamond industry, the diamond engagement ring scam. Imagine you're on the beach with the love of your life. You're both looking at the sunset when you realize that it's time to pop the question. You hold your soon-to-be fiance's hand, get down on one knee, and present her with a small, tiny box. Inside of that tiny box is a diamond wedding ring that costs twice your monthly salary. And you're just praying that she loves it. Your soon-to-be fiance looks down at the ring and then looks at you only to say yes. This, for most people, is one of the happiest days of their life. However, it's ironic because this is one of the biggest scams that most people fall for. And no, I'm not saying anything about the institution of marriage, but have you ever questioned why we propose with diamond engagement rings? Or think of what would have happened if you proposed without a diamond ring, or at least a ring that resembled a diamond? And while I can't answer that second question for you, I can definitely answer the first. And the short answer is marketing. That's right, the entire diamond engagement ring tradition actually took place because of an advertising campaign. During the late 1800s, diamonds were not rare at all, and huge diamond mines were discovered all across South Africa. And as a result, the market was flooded with many huge raw diamonds, essentially collapsing the entire diamond market. This was obviously detrimental for jewelers and anybody mining, processing, and selling raw diamonds, which is why the mining company De Beers had to think fast and change the trajectory of the diamond market forever. And that they did. Prior to the 1930s, when you proposed to somebody, a diamond ring was not a requirement whatsoever. It wasn't even a consideration. However, that all began to change in the late 1930s with one of De Beers' many marketing campaigns. At this time, De Beers was actively bombarding the public with messaging along the lines of, hey, the only way to prove your love to your soon-to-be fiance is by giving her a valuable diamond ring. And in 1938, De Beers even coined the term, a diamond is forever, insinuating giving somebody a diamond ring at your proposal ensures everlasting love. Not only did De Beers plan a hostile takeover of the average American engagement, but they also planned a hostile takeover over your bank account. Because not only did they want you to buy a diamond ring for your engagement, but they also convinced you that the only acceptable ring was equivalent to 2 months of your take-home salary, which is once again insane and egregious. However, people bought it up, and this myth is still perpetuated to this day. But all isn't lost, right? Because even if you fall for this scam, at least diamonds have some sort of market and value, right? While that may be true in some cases, you are never going to get the value back you paid for your ring. And ironically enough, in 1999, the De Beers chairman, Nicky Oppenheimer, said, quote, quote, "Diamonds are intrinsically worthless," basically laughing in the face of everybody that De Beers manipulated over the last almost 100 years. So yeah, De Beers specifically made you feel obligated to buy a diamond ring with your proposal, made you feel worthless if you didn't spend way more than you could afford on it, and also made you feel stupid if you ever tried to sell it and realized that it's actually worth nowhere near what you paid for it. Which makes me think that the whole diamond is forever thing was basically just a slogan ensuring that people never resold their diamonds. But that's just a theory. Regardless, it's kind of just sad that a tradition that is so ingrained within our society is actually based in manipulation and lies. Oh, and if you watched our video a few weeks ago about the craziest conspiracies part 4, then you might remember me talking about the crazy cigarette advertisements of the 1930s that also changed the world. You know, the advertisements that literally had pregnant mothers and doctors promoting cigarettes? Yeah, the advertisements of the 1930s need to be studied because they had such a detrimental impact on society. But that's beyond the scope of this video. Let's keep moving. Textbook trickery. Picture this. You are in the kitchen looking at your laptop with your family all anxiously waiting around you. You have just received an email response from your dream college either accepting or denying your application. In this moment, feels like it could be make or break. Reluctantly, you click on the email without even looking, and slowly you unsquint your eyes only to hear your parents scream and to see the email say, "Accepted." This is such an exciting moment and milestone that should be celebrated. A few months goes by and the beginning of the school semester starts. You go to the college orientation and you are given a list of books you need to buy for your courses for this semester. Awesome. You decide to go to the school bookstore only to realize that these textbooks were more money than you've ever spent in your entire life. For a lot of students, this is not only disheartening, but extremely detrimental. Because if you've just paid out of pocket or got into thousands and thousands of dollars of debt to go into school, only to then need to pay thousands more in textbooks, you could be putting yourself in a very bad spot. And if you're in school, your capacity to work is already low, meaning that you're setting yourself up not for the future you thought you had, but for a lifetime of debt. If you currently are or were a student within the last 20 years, then you know exactly what I'm talking about when I say that college textbooks are literally a scam. Obviously, college textbooks are extremely expensive, but the scam goes far beyond that. In 2010, the average college student in America spent $1,200 per year on textbooks and school supplies, with the majority of that being textbooks. Similar to buying a diamond engagement ring, buying expensive textbooks seems like this is something that people have always done, but that's actually not the case. Over the last 30 years, college textbook prices have increased by 800%. And this gross exponential growth in textbook price doesn't only have an effect on the student's wallet, but also on their education. Because as of 2016, almost 65% of college students in America opted out of buying textbooks because they were too expensive. As they should, although not having the most up-to-date textbooks does directly have an impact on their ability to learn, affecting their education, the whole reason they're in school in the first place. And the textbook companies not only know this, but actually go the extra mile to ensure that the older textbooks not only have less value, but are also less helpful. Let me explain. Most college or university textbooks have a new edition every single year, and today typically include some sort of bonus content only accessible with the newest book. But this access code can only be used once, and typically the content that you are accessing you will only have for a certain amount of time. Some universities require you to buy a brand new textbook so that you can access this code to do extracurricular homework or to do additional tasks, meaning that colleges are not only complicit, but actually an active participant in the scam as well. Because in most cases, colleges get a commission from these hyperinflated textbook prices. And if you compare a previous edition to the most recent edition, there is typically little to no changes in terms of content within the textbook. However, there is one major change you will notice, and that is the order of the information. And the reason why this is one, so the textbook seems different because things are in different orders, but also primarily so that the textbook of the previous year is not usable to current students. Imagine if you're in a class and everybody else has the new textbook, but you have the old textbook. If you're asking somebody for help and they say, "Oh, flip to page 45, but your 45 isn't their 45, your experience is already dwindled because you didn't spend the money in a new book. That is an intentional scam that directly affects your learning experience. And if you're a company that literally sells textbooks, I have no idea how you can justify this practice at all. To me, this is insanely predatory and just upsetting. Don't be complicit in the scam. Inform your friends and also do what's best for your interest and your budget. These college textbook companies make enough money. Get a used copy, or if you find one online, well, I won't tell anybody. The diet pill debacle. The health and supplement industry is riddled with scams. And that topic is an entirely separate video on its own. But the supplements I want to focus on specifically are diet pills. Diet pills generally are any supplement that claim that they can help you lose fat or burn calories simply by taking the pill and doing nothing else. These supplements are largely cash grabs that prey upon insecure people, and it's truly upsetting. Most diet pills rely on deceptive marketing, white lies, and half-truths to even be able to make any sort of claim, and that's why I wanted to call them out and expose a lot of the scammery associated with diet pills specifically. If you're a bro that's ever had a little bit of flub on your chub and you just wished you could kind of get rid of it with the snap of your fingers, then you would have been the prime target for one of these diet pill companies. Because the entire dream that these diet pill companies sell is that they can help you take all of your insecurities and literally excess body fat away if you buy their product and, well, give them money. But the reality is that over-the-counter supplements are not able to help make this change. They do nothing at all. Diet pills, also known as fat burners in the fitness industry, typically contain one of two ingredients. The first ingredient is some sort of caffeine-based stimulant, and they may, in addition or potentially separately, also contain an unregulated herbal blend, both with the same goal of either suppressing your appetite or boosting your metabolism. Already, you might have noticed a massive issue with the whole unregulated herbal blend, and that's because this blend is being curated and sold by companies that truly do not care about the consumer because their entire business relies on scamming the consumer. Because nobody in the supplement or fitness industry really believes in any sort of fat-burning supplement. It just doesn't work, or at the very least, not in the way that they say it does. Regardless, these stimulant mixes and herbal blends are only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to these fat burners, because assuming that they're at least safe, which they are in most cases, you're still being scammed, but at least you're not being scammed and poisoned. Now, the appetite suppression or potential metabolism boost you may find from these fat burners is negligible and doesn't cause a noticeable result at all in most individuals. What people who do take fat burners typically experience is a slightly reduced appetite and potentially a placebo effect. But even if this reduced appetite is causing you to lose weight, the weight loss is extremely not only negligible but also unsustainable if it even happens at all, simply because you're not addressing the core issue at play, which is typically your caloric intake and the amount of exercise you get on a daily basis. But besides the fact that the effects are either unsustainable or non-existent, these blends are not without their side effects. And common side effects from these fat burners include insomnia, anxiety, high blood pressure, and even digestive issue because of the massive amount of stimulants. Also, in combination with these herbal blends that your body may have never interacted with and may have an interesting reaction with. So already we're off to a rough start because the blends that they're using are questionable, and the results are actually, well, also once again questionable. But I think the nail in the coffin for fat burners or diet pills is definitely the deceptive marketing and business strategies that drive the entire industry. Roughly 95 to 99% of the entire fat burning supplement industry use ridiculous before and after photos and have insane claims that are not backed by science whatsoever. And in the United States, the National Institute of Health has even stated that very few dietary supplements that have been marketed for weight loss have been proven to be effective at all. And what is more reported with fat burning and weight loss pills is not weight loss, but actually serious health complications, typically liver damage and heart problems. Two things often associated with unregulated herbal blends and caffeine abuse. And I know a lot of you might be thinking, wow, this guy talks really fast, he must drink a lot of caffeine himself. And truthfully, I don't do caffeine because this is me normally, and I couldn't imagine myself on caffeine. And I know you definitely wouldn't like it either. But predatory marketing and questionable ingredients aside, one of the biggest issues with the whole diet pill fat burning supplement industry is the fact that they rely on legal loopholes to keep their products on shelves. These companies know that they're selling scams, and these companies are doing everything they can to be just within the lines to still be technically legal. In a lot of cases, companies that are selling these fat burning pills are typically either rebranding or tweaking existing formulas depending on whether or not they've been banned by the FDA yet. If there is an existing fat burning blend, then companies can simply white label that product, slap their name on it, and sell it. However, if the FDA bans one of the ingredients in this formula, then all they need to do is simply swap that one ingredient and start a new brand that hasn't had their reputation tainted by the fact that they used banned ingredients by the FDA. One of the biggest loopholes that these supplement companies use is the actual term supplement. While these fat burners and diet pills have claims that would be reminiscent of a pharmaceutical drug or potentially something like a GLP-1 medication, these drugs are technically classified as a supplement, meaning that they have not gone through the rigorous testing and scrutiny that pharmaceutical drugs do. Now, that by itself doesn't mean that pharmaceutical drugs are off the hook. That's an entirely separate can of worms, but focusing on these supplements specifically, they leverage the fact that supplements have a lower bar when it comes to testing and a lower barrier of entry when it comes to getting into the market. Now, you might be asking yourself, how are diet pills and fat burners still selling in 2025 if they've been sold over the last, 20, 30, 40 years and they have been proven to not be effective? And the reason is, sucker is born every day. Unfortunately, there's always going to be people that are unhappy with their self-image and struggling and looking for any sort of way to feel better or potentially make progress. progress. And that's where these pills are able to take advantage of these people. And these brands know that, which is why they're remaining on shelves and still make sales in this day. And the whole weight loss, fat burning supplement industry is still a multi-billion-dollar business. These companies know that they're selling hopes and dreams in a bottle. And for that reason, I would consider them a scam. But if you're a bro who's considering buying some sort of weight loss supplement or fat burning pill, just understand that literally going on a 10 to 20 minute walk every day would be more effective and safer and cheaper than any fat burning supplement you could buy. Eat healthy food, get active, and enjoy your life. It's really that simple. Don't let companies tell you you're not enough or that you need their product to be worthy. Claw machine chaos. Before we get to the last entry on this list, if you guys have enjoyed this video about everyday scams you're probably still falling for, please feel free to let me know if you want a part 2 by either leaving a like or leaving a comment below. This video has been super fun to make, and unfortunately there is so many scams to cover. Regardless, let's talk about claw machines because I am still salty right now. Picture this. You go to your favorite arcade, convert $100 of real money into 40,000 fake tokens. You take your tokens and you go to the large claw machine, and in there you find the cutest stuffed animal ever. You decide you're going to play a few rounds, and you end up spending the next 20 minutes using all of your credits, basically $100 real, trying to get the stuffed animal worth maybe 20 that you did not get. This may or may not have been a real situation that happened to me recently, and for that reason, claw machines are scams. I'm half joking. They're not a scam because I lost. They are a scam because I lost and I researched it and I found out they're a scam. Basically, every machine that takes money for a prize has something known as an adjustable payout. And what an adjustable payout is basically a mechanism within the computer, within this device that you're playing on or gaming on, that determines whether or not you're going to win or lose a prize. Claw machines are not a skill game. They're literally just gambling machines. And for that reason, under US law, they are classified as amusement machines, the same classification that slot machines are under. And they all basically work the same way. Now, going back to adjustable payouts, basically every prize-based machine can only be won once a certain threshold of money has been earned. Let me break it down. Let's say that there's a claw machine that has a bunch of toys that are worth $1 in it. Let's say that the person who owns the claw machine is really greedy. And let's say that he sets the adjustable payout to every time the claw machine makes $100, the claw machine will then officially have the strength required to pick up one of the $1 prizes. In that case, every 99 children is going to be very upset that they wasted their dollar and didn't get a prize. However, that very lucky and random one person who actually gets a claw that has any sort of strength to it is going to get a prize, and, well, they're going to get their dollar back in the form of that toy. However, for 99% of people, that is not the case. And the game that seemingly relies on skill actually ends up being a game of chance. So yeah, if you've ever used a claw machine and wondered why the thing was just so limp and if it would ever win ever, well, it will win, just not when you're playing, or at least not likely. And the claw does have strength behind it, but it's only going to happen 1 out of 10, 20, 30, 50, 100, 1,000 times. And that's how claw machines and all gaming machines make money. They have items that are worth X amount of money, and they'll only let you win once they've made their return that they want to make. So if you ever see a machine with really expensive items in it, just realize that it's going to take a lot of money for that prize to ever be paid out. And while it's actually really fun to go to arcades and play with claw machines, understand that you're paying for the experience and the fun. And you are in no way, shape, or form ever going to make a return in any form of gambling. How to get rich in every time period. Not too long ago, I made a video about what it was like to be rich in every time period, and you guys really liked that video. In that video, I talked about the experiences and the lifestyle of wealthy people in every time period, and only briefly touched on how that wealth was typically acquired. But in this video, I wanted to provide some perspective on how wealth could be made and how you could get rich in every time period. Let's get started. The Stone Age. This segment is likely going to be the most wholesome on the entire list, and that's just because the Stone Age was a simpler time. Genuinely, not many things were required to be wealthy, and the concept of being rich or wealthy didn't even exist. In the Stone Age, simply surviving was hard enough. So if you miraculously survived childbirth and somehow survived the brutality of a Stone Age childhood, you were already essentially a billionaire. And everything even remotely close to wealth had to do directly with your survivability. That meant food, shelter, water, your livelihood, and in turn, your wealth. So now that we understand that the modern concept of wealth simply doesn't apply here, what does wealth look like in the Stone Age, and how could you acquire it? Let's start from the beginning. Like I mentioned earlier, to be wealthy, you first need to be alive. And that means the basis of our wealth will be our life. And as a baby, our life is in the hands of our parents. So the original rich babies or boss babies or Nepo babies were simply kids that were lucky enough to have parents that didn't die during childbirth or didn't accidentally kill them or allow them to be killed in their likely harsh environment. Already, this is making me realize how much we take for granted. Next up, assuming your parents care about you, survived childbirth, don't plan on killing you, and are healthy, fit, and able to provide for you properly, you will be able to experience childhood the Stone Age way, which is basically just Minecraft, but not a game, just a reality. Now, assuming you survived your entire childhood and adolescence, you are now an adult in the Stone Age on your own, looking to build wealth for yourself. And by that, I mean literally just survive. I'm really stressing this point because it is extremely important to consider that simply surviving up until this point is a major achievement and basically the equivalent of being handed a $100 million trust fund as soon as you turn 18. But now in this hypothetical scenario, when you are alive, healthy, and on your own, what do you do next? Unfortunately, there is no online business or jobs, and if you want something, you have to go get it. Literally. The first thing you would need to get is food, which is the first and likely primary pillar of wealth in the Stone Age, a steady supply of food. Being on land that was fertile, not only for yourself but for animals, directly impacted your likelihood of survival, and therefore, your wealth. If you lived in the right biome, nature would provide for you, as long as you were a semi-skilled hunter and in tune with your environment. However, the wrong biome would leave you starved and dehydrated in only a matter of days. This directly ties into the next pillar of wealth, which I'll combine two separate parts into one: location and shelter. Of course, food is essential for life and, in this case, wealth. But like we discussed, to have this steady source of food, you must have a conducive environment, which in itself is a form of wealth. But I kind of already made that point, so without repeating myself, let's discuss the second part of this: shelter. Depending on what part of the Stone Age we're talking about, because it does go pretty far back, a lot of shelters were more or less natural, with the most common being a cave, hence the term caveman. If you wanted to be rich, and I mean ultra rich, you lived on land that provided you food and also had shelter that was ready for you to move right in. Consider this prime real estate. This is the prehistoric equivalent of moving into a condo that has a restaurant on the main floor. It's everything you need all in one place. Well, almost everything. We're still missing an essential component, which is the third pillar, that being water. You now have your prime real estate. You have your cave. You have your wild berries growing outside your cave apartment, and you have a steady flow of cute critters that you stomp on and eat on a daily basis. But the last thing to make you a true bajillionaire is to have a steady stream of fresh water, ideally trickling right through a stream right outside of your cave. Without water, shelter and food is almost useless because you won't be around long to enjoy it. So this supply of water is the perfect trifecta for your life and, in this case, your wealth. But it's a bit boring if we end there. What's wealth without a bit of legacy? And maybe someone to share it with. Just because living was hard enough in the Stone Age doesn't mean that there wasn't additional luxuries you could indulge in. And for this example, let's pick our bonuses. I have my cave, I have my food, I have my water. What am I missing? I'd say a cave woman to spend my days with and unga bunga with at night. And with your partner by your side, you're now able to continue your legacy, have Caveman Jr., and ideally allow them to inherit your success. And by that I mean your cave doesn't get raided, the stream doesn't dry up, and the animals don't migrate elsewhere. And spoiler alert, those are all going to happen. And all of your hard work is basically null and void because everything that you had to go through to build your wealth and literally survive is going to have to be done entirely from scratch once again by your children. I think I've made it crystal clear that wealth in the Stone Age is simply being alive. So to answer the question, how do you get rich in the Stone Age? You just don't die. The Bronze Age. No, not the guy that plays for the Lakers, the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age is really a landmark in terms of human development. And as we'll see in this segment, there are many changes between humans and wealth in the Stone Age and the Bronze Age. For starters, the Bronze Age is a much more concentrated timeline. The Stone Age, for example, literally goes on for millions of years, whereas the Bronze Age is roughly 2,000 years in total. Don't allow this relatively short timeline to fool you. The amount of development that took place during this era was rapid and impactful. Some major differences right off the bat between the Stone Age and the Bronze Age is that people began to settle. In the Stone Age, a lot of people were nomadic, similar to animals, going where the resources were, as typically ideal locations didn't last very long. But with the introduction of agriculture and other advanced survival techniques, people were able to settle in locations that were deemed ideal. One major difference between the Stone Age and the Bronze Age that was spawned out of settlements were possessions. Because when you are nomadic, you're not able to carry much with you, and for that reason, you didn't own much. On the contrary, when you have a place to call your own, you're able to start collecting a thing or two. And from that, begin to store value and ultimately accumulate wealth. Besides this, we are seeing early coinage, and with this, early commerce as well, which will serve as the foundation for how we measure wealth for the rest of the video. With developed skills, new tools, larger settlements, and early coinage, it's not hard to believe that trade was essentially inevitable. What did they trade, you may ask? Well, everything, but most importantly, bronze. And although settlements and trade are developing, it doesn't necessarily mean that life was all of a sudden easy at this point. Life was still difficult, and every skill and piece of luck required to survive in the Stone Age is still required now. But for the sake of this video, we're gonna assume this is more or less of a given, so we can focus on the specifics of what made you rich in the Bronze Age. Like we mentioned in the last video, during the Bronze Age, wealth began to be associated with the control and production of bronze, which is a valuable metal that is made from copper and tin. Being rich meant you had access to metal ores and the knowledge required to craft tools, weapons, and ornaments, which were things that everybody needed. Maybe not the ornaments, but tools and weapons definitely. Like I mentioned, with settlements growing, trade became more prominent, both inside of settlements and also between settlements via established trade routes. And if you are someone who was able to take advantage of these trade routes, you could significantly enhance your wealth. Besides commerce, another way to gain money and power was through social status, which started to become more of an important thing during this time period. During this time, chiefs and leaders would amass their wealth through the people that they ruled, whether they had full control over the tribe's resources or they simply took contributions from each of their people. Now that we have a bit more context on the Bronze Age and what exactly wealth looked like in the Bronze Age, how could you get rich? For the sake of simplicity, let's assume that you had a great upbringing. Your parents were alive and you survived, and now you're 18 years old looking to build your life and become wealthy in the Bronze Age. Like I mentioned, you ultimately have two primary options. One is to become a merchant, or two, become a leader. We'll touch on both of these. Starting with becoming a merchant, the control and manufacturing of copper was a booming industry. So if I were planning to get rich, I would definitely start there. The first thing I would do is start looking for copper. I would make my wood and maybe even stone pickaxe and get straight to the mines, looking for any copper deposits I could find. Now, this isn't obviously the only way you could gain wealth. I think a better way to gain wealth in the Bronze Age is to become an artisan, specifically making the best type of either tool, weapon, or ornament. For this example, let's say that we want to make the best sword possible. In this case, I would go to a blacksmith and immediately beg them for their knowledge. I don't care if I was unpaid. I don't care if I was like SpongeBob with the Krusty Krab and I had to pay to work there. I would be getting my hours in at the blacksmith so I could hone in my skills on making the best swords possible. Why would I do that? Well, if I could make the best swords and gain a reputation as the guy who makes the best swords, which would hopefully be my official title, I would hope to potentially make a name for myself and ideally catch the attention of the powers that be. Because you know who needs swords? The troops. And you know who wants their troops to win battles? Leaders. And you know who has all of the money? Also leaders. For the most part. I think you see where I'm going here. That's just one example, but if you were doing anything valuable related to copper, chances are you were able to make a few shillings for yourself. But let's just say for this example, you weren't very inclined to mine or craft. And in that example, I would recommend you go the route of leadership. How would I go about that? I would first identify the powers that be. You could try to assassinate him and hopefully fill the power vacuum, but I think that the likelihood of that working out are low. This would definitely be a slow grind, but if you're willing to put in the time and you're charismatic enough, I think it could work. I would get as close as possible as I could to the leader, maybe potentially offering to be some sort of servant. At this point, I would do my absolute best to gain their trust, gain their respect, and ideally become someone that they consider to be a friend. Through this relationship, I would prove that my ideas were worthy and that I potentially had the skills to be a leader, without ever, of course, showing up the leader himself. At this point, over time, I would wait for opportunities to arise where I could potentially fill voids where leadership was needed or ideas were required. And hopefully, through my connection to the actual leader, I could become a person of power myself and benefiting from that sweet, sweet Bronze Age nepotism. Now, in reality, were people in the Bronze Age really so entrepreneurial focused or status focused that they'd be willing to cozy up to the king? I think potentially. And people like this definitely existed, but they weren't the norm. Most people were just trying to exist, and serfdom was basically hard labor all day to feed yourself and your family and potentially make a few dollars on the side, or simply to do your duties for the village that you lived in to make sure that you had the protection that they'd offered you. So to answer the question of how do you get rich in the Bronze Age, I'd say your best bet is to get involved in the bronze industry in any way that you think you would excel the most. In my example, I wanted to master blacksmithing swords and use this to my advantage to essentially get government contracts, or at the very least, sell desirable artisan swords to rich merchants and political leaders, and ultimately get that bag. The Iron Age. What a time to be alive. During the Bronze Age, we experienced more development in 2,000 years than we did during the over 3 million years of human existence in the Stone Age. Due to this exponential growth, you would likely assume that this trend continued into the Iron Age, but that's not exactly the case. Like we mentioned in the previous video, the end of the Bronze Age was a rather rough time, and due to major situations that happened, which are honestly worthy of their own video, most of the world was left in a place where production, trade routes, literacy, and overall progress were either diminished or reduced, making the Bronze Age more or less of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back sort of situation. That being said, it's not all doom and gloom because we're humans and we're Chads, and we ultimately figured it out. Obviously, just look at us now. But that leads us to the beginning of the Iron Age. We needed to rebuild, and we needed to do it now. The beginning of the Iron Age was very similar to the beginning of the Bronze Age, with the primary difference, of course, being the metal at play, which, you guessed it, was iron. Iron wasn't necessarily a stronger material, but it was more readily available and it was easier to produce, which helped facilitate a lot of progress. Which is why, if you're paying attention to the dates, you'll notice that the Iron Age was also much shorter than the Bronze Age, and the Bronze Age was much shorter than the Stone Age. The exponential growth is still continuing even after the bump in the road. Now, that's a nice underdog story and all, but how do we get rich? Like I mentioned in the last video, being rich in the Iron Age was not very different than being rich in the Bronze Age. And I hate to break it to you, getting rich in the Iron Age also wasn't very different than getting rich in the Bronze Age. But I'll still give you a new hypothetical in this new time period. Let's assume that once again, you're a healthy, able-bodied, 18-year-old ready to start your life. The artisan sword company that your parents had founded has now gone Bronze Age bankrupt and they are dead. For the sake of this story, they just died too. They went broke and died. So now you're here, alone, looking to get that bag in the Iron Age. What do you do? Once again, you have 2 options. Get involved in emerging industries, in this case, the production of iron, or try to get as cozy as possible with the powers that be, which at this point in time isn't an easy task. So in this case, I'm becoming an iron mogul. With establishments growing and jobs becoming more or less of a thing, my plan is to find and own the best iron deposit my settlement and likely other settlements have ever seen. But here's the thing, if I'm just one guy looking around for iron deposits, I may not be that successful, and I may miss things. And even once I do find it, there's a lot of work to be done there. I guess what I'm trying to say is, I'll need help. First thing I'll do is go to the nearest farm. I'm going to try to round up as many farmers that I can find who are no longer interested in farming and looking for a better opportunity. At this point, everyone's been seeing the new and shiny iron tools and they know that they're expensive. And likely they're interested and want their own. And my proposal to them would be, join my team, help me find an iron deposit, let's mine it together, and with you, I will share the rewards. Realistically, the proposal is no money up front, but a lot of money down the line if you're willing to work with me. And once I have a good group of guys, we're ready to go. Day 1, we're looking, searching, scoundering, floundering, sleuthing, anything we can do to find iron deposits. Once this has been achieved, we begin the hard work, mining. We gather as much as we can and determine how good this vein of iron really is. And if we see potential, we set up camp. Once we begin mining, we begin either collaborating with an existing manufacturing facility or we build our own to be able to turn the raw materials into a usable iron to make tools, weapons, and once again, ornaments. Once we get a more refined process, we then begin to stockpile and finally sell our refined material. We could sell the raw material, but we also know that if we sell a more refined material, we can get more money. And from that point, we begin our journey. All of the men that were mining are now selling. Door to door, potentially. We are going to every blacksmith and offering them the best iron in the best condition with minimal work on their end. Just heat it and forge it. What more could you want? Ideally, once again, the leaders at B take notice and want to buy my iron, but I'm happy if even just the blacksmiths prefer mine. At this point, we begin to collect money and it's a beautiful system. In the Bronze Age, I wanted to make the swords, and in the Iron Age, I was the person selling the materials to those artisans. Is this a realistic plan? I highly doubt it. This oversimplified, trust me bro hypothetical is leaving out so many components. Specifically, all of the violence that would have potentially taken place either between my team, between settlements, between people in my settlement that wanted my iron deposits, and so many other things that could have potentially existed. I'm just now realizing that this video is basically what it was like to be an entrepreneur in every time period, which I guess makes sense because entrepreneurship and wealth typically go hand in hand. The medieval era. Now things are really heating up and we are in full swing of development. People are settled and civilization is making major strides. There's a very established class system and money is more important than ever. The richest people in the medieval era were the people that were closest to the powers that be, those being the nobility and the merchants that were able to sell products over very long distances. Both of these were extremely useful to the king and therefore paid very nicely. And considering the major wealth gap in the huge centralization of money and power, your best bet was to get money from the king, because most other people just didn't have it. During this time, spices, precious metals, and silk were extremely desirable materials, and I'm going to use those to my advantage once we get to the hypothetical. For my plan to get rich in the medieval era, I want to do something different. I'm done being an entrepreneur. I want to now become a criminal. And for this reason, I'll need to target merchants. You see, the nobility had most of their wealth come from the land that they owned, which was given to them from the monarch. And it's rather hard to steal land, at least not without a fight. So I think I'm better off stealing from the long-distance merchants. In this time period, I am more motivated than ever to get my bag up because we are starting to see the early equivalent of modern luxuries. Large, beautiful castles, servants, comfy clothes, something that kind of resembles a toilet, concubines, jewel-encrusted stuff, and other fun stuff like that. So yeah, let's get rich. Although my plan may seem simple, with nations developing and with power becoming centralized, I am at greater risk than ever of being reprimanded for the crimes I'm about to commit. Because now there is rule, there is order, and I need to be very careful about how I go about breaking it. I'll start my journey once again like every other journey as an 18-year-old looking to build my life. Let's say that I was born into an established kingdom, into a regular poor family. My goal is to become a known member of society and a positive one at that. I want to be active in the church, helping those in need, and seen often within the community. But this will work in my favor for my malicious intentions. My goal is to gain the trust specifically of the rich merchants doing long distance trade because they, one, have the most money, and two, are the most vulnerable. See, being a thief, I could try to pickpocket around my city, but eventually it's gonna catch up to me. And honestly, there's a cap to how much money I can make. Back to my trust with the merchants. My goal is for them to feel comfortable sharing their information with me, specifically when trade shipments are going out, what the shipments are, and where they're going to be. For example, imagine I just go around the city with a broom every so often, just out of my goodwill, but I always somehow happen to broom where the rich merchants are. This isn't by accident. I want to overhear them, and ideally, I want to gain information. If I'm sweeping right beside two rich merchants having a discussion outside and I overhear one of them telling the other one that they had a large shipment of spices just get delivered and they are currently days away from getting their large payment, I'm going to inquire. I may ask this merchant how the shipment went and where they shipped it and where they even got the spices. I'm going to pretend like I'm interested in the business, when in reality, I just want to know when's that money coming into town and what route is it going to take. Let's just assume that this merchant slips up and he accidentally tells me that his people always come in the back route to the kingdom and they always head home under the veil of night. At that point, I have all of the information I need. I will go about my day, and as soon as the sun starts to set, I will put on my dark cloak and begin my journey. I will begin my trek on the back trail, getting outside of the kingdom and closer to my reward. I'll likely go 10, 20, 30, maybe even 40 kilometers on the trail. Something far enough from my kingdom so nobody knows what's going on, but still not too far that I can't do it in one night. I have two options. I can either hide and sneak attack these people on the way back, or I could gain their attention in other ways. For this example, my strategy is tricking the merchants into stopping and thinking that I need help. I brought a second robe with me and I folded it in a way that made it look like it was a swaddled baby. I'm going to be sitting in the middle of the trail holding my baby, rocking back and forth, hysterically waiting for them. Once they arrive, I'm going to beg them for their help and tell them that they need to help save my baby. I am going to be inconsolable and overwhelming to them. They're going to want to leave me immediately. And fortunately, I don't need much time to distract them. Because the merchant didn't tell me who was carrying the gold and where it was held, pickpocketing here is useless, and my only option is to kill them. Because I have the agility and sword skills of an absolute ninja, I flawlessly cut them all in half and they die instantly. And with my expertly placed slices, the bag of gold and silver instantly reveals itself to me. I grab the loot, leave the men, and head back into my kingdom. I arrive the same night I left, I put my robe away, and in the morning, I start the nice side of my double life. Here's the problem with this situation. If money's going missing all the time, and I, a poor person, all of a sudden becomes rich, people are gonna ask questions. So I can't really spend my money, but that's okay. Because once I'm satisfied with the amount of money I have, I can leave my settlement and begin a new life. If I can travel far enough and go to places where I've never been heard of, which is likely the case if I'm just a locally known, gentle, poor person, in any new settlement I go to, I can tell them a rather convincing story that I am a wealthy merchant who was ran out of town by a bad gang and I'm just looking to have a peaceful life somewhere nice. Is this a likely or potentially even realistic situation? I highly doubt it, once again, but I think it's an actually pretty funny hypothetical of one way a rather evil person could get rich in the medieval era. And honestly, I would bet money that something like this happened at least once, and was probably more common than we think. Violence was common, robbery was everywhere, law only really existed inside of castle walls, and people were brutal. So to answer your question, how do you get rich in the medieval era? Well, there's plenty of ways, but if you're not born into money and you're not willing to put in the effort to become a successful merchant, I'd say your best bet is to go all Assassin's Creed and become the best thief you can absolutely be. The early modern era. At this point, we've gone through millions of years of history, and the early modern era is our last stop before the modern day. And the early modern era, although relatively short, is one of the most influential eras of all time, and is where we see the foundation set for the modern world that we live in today. In good ways and bad ways too. In the early modern era, wealth was driven by exploration, trade, and colonization. Nations and individuals who invested in voyages reaped enormous profits from new trade routes and new resources. Merchants are richer than ever, and now the early versions of bankers are also accumulating wealth through the emerging global trade. Like almost every other time period, owning land and engaging in agriculture is still extremely important. But with the continued growth of commerce, finance, and manufacturing, more and more opportunities are beginning to present themselves to, once again, get that bag. So we're in the early modern era. How are we gonna get rich? Well, we have two new options, exploration and colonization. And for the sake of my reputation, let's go with exploration. My goal as an explorer is going to be to build the absolute best team of cartographers, navigators, researchers, and writers, so I can not only establish new trade routes, but also make extra money by developing maps and documenting what I'm seeing on my journeys. Because during this point in time, a lot of the world was unmapped and undiscovered, at least to some people. I guess my first step would be to beg the king for a boat and a small loan. This won't be easy, but I'll tell him that I have the best cartographers, the best writers, the best captains, and the best people on my team to make sure that our voyages not only find new lands, but bring back artifacts, establish trade routes with the people that are there, if any, and that the places that we go are documented not only in map form, but in the written word. And if that doesn't convince the king for him to fund my journey, I don't know what will. So in this case, assuming he does, I now have a boat and a small loan of money. But there's one problem. All of those people that I told the king I had on my team, I don't have on my team. And I don't even have a team. So now I gotta get them. And during this time period, where do you think the best and the brightest would be? Do you think they would be the guy sitting on the side of the road drinking wine and ale? Likely not. They're likely in the government where I just got the boat and the loan. Now, of course, I can't ask the king for these people because then he'll know I'm lying. So I have to be a bit more creative. What I'm going to do is I'm going to identify the key players in the government, specifically for captains and cartographers, and I'm gonna go to them and tell them, hey, the king gave me a loan, a boat, and he told me that you have to come with me. Now, of course, he could verify this with the king unless I told him a reason not to. I'm gonna tell these people that the king is mad at them. And I don't know why, but the king said that if he saw them again, he was going to have them executed. And for that reason, these people should come on this adventure with me. Not only to get out of the king's sight for a bit, but also to get back in the king's good graces. This may seem manipulative, and you're 100% right, but it's also, in this situation, my only option. And now, my house of cards is finally complete, and together, we set sail. On this boat, I am more or less useless, so I am trusting the captain and the cartographer with this entire operation essentially. Fortunately, a lot of areas are simply unmapped, so I just tell the cartographer to tell the captain to go where we haven't gone before, at least where we don't have recorded evidence of going. And from that point, we're off. Even at this point in the story, we've done so much and risked so much just to even get here, and we haven't even made $1 yet, and we are still relatively poor. We have a loaned out ship, a team of people that we're deceiving, and debt to the government in the form of the loan. And if we're unable to find anything of substance, we're cooked. And my elaborate ruse is over. But because everything has kind of perfectly fallen into place in the story, let's continue that trend. And let's say on our first voyage, we discover the most amazing thing ever. What is it, you may ask? It's a remote, abandoned island where the richest pirate gangs hid all of their most valuable loot, including coins, artifacts, booty, and slightly used peg legs. At this point, I need to come clean. I tell the guys, hey, you guys are all being lied to, and if you don't continue the lie with me, then we're all gonna die. The men agree, we get the loot, we go back home, and we do it again and again. And we all live happily ever after. That's just one hypothetical about how you could use exploration to your advantage to get rich in the early modern era. And in case you wanted to learn about how to use colonization to get rich, well, just read a history book. The modern era. Well, guys, can't you believe it? I've been able to cover millions of years of history, and somehow I've made no mistakes and left out no information. Everything I've said has been completely accurate and not totally oversimplified, glossed over, uninformed, and almost entirely hypothetical. That's crazy. But now, here we are in the modern day. A time period you may be familiar with. I don't think I need to explain too much about what being rich in the present day looks like, but I'll give a quick example. If you want a negative example, I recommend going to our channel and watching this video about rich weirdos. But if you want some positive examples, rich people just like cool stuff. Big houses, big boats, fast cars. And if you're really rich, space travel, and goth girlfriends. Now, getting into how you can get rich in the present day, the opportunities are honestly endless. If you're currently watching this looking for a way to get rich, I'm gonna give you a foolproof plan to make more money than you could ever even imagine. The first thing you're going to want to do is grow your hair. Get it as long as possible. The next step is to grow facial hair and get tattoos. This will come in handy. After this, you need to establish a wardrobe of white t-shirts and basketball shorts. And once you have the look, you can begin the work. I need you to every single day begin posting on YouTube. Talk about stuff. Talk about stuff you like. Talk about stuff you don't like. Talk about that time you were almost in a movie. Talk about anything. Over time, people are going to respect you, idolize you, love you, and ultimately need your opinion for just about anything. And people are gonna eat this up. And advertisers are gonna wanna sponsor you and put their ads on your video, making you rich. Oh, and now that you have the system of getting rich and the look, you're probably gonna need a name. How about Dry Ineffective or Polar Bear 1? Something along those lines. You guys pick. But in case that's not replicatable for you guys, here's another great idea on how to get rich in the present day. Step 1 is be born into a family where your parents see you more as an opportunity to make money than their flesh and blood. At that point, have parents that create a toy channel based around you. After a few videos of you opening toys that you're excited about, your parents will begin raking in the money. And as you grow up, you'll be like, I had a weird childhood, but my parents are rich. And I think I have money, maybe. And later down the line, we'll see what happens. So yeah, 2 extremely replicatable and honestly foolproof plans on how to get rich in the present day. What war was like in every time period. War and violence has been a timeless theme throughout human history. And although war never changes, some aspects of war do. Specifically, fighting styles, weapons, motivations, and other stuff like that. So today, let's learn why and how war evolved over time. The Stone Age. Technically, there isn't much evidence for war in the Stone Age. But I mean, come on. Does anyone think that humans who have been committing atrocities against each other for all of recorded history somehow all of a sudden were just peaches because they were cavemen? Like I said in the beginning of the video, war and violence is just part of the human condition. Thus, it's fair to assume that we still had wars before most of recorded history. And yes, that includes amongst cavemen. And I'm not just pulling this out of my cave, man. There's archaeological evidence for this. But first, what generally started wars in the Stone Age? Well, in the Paleolithic era, prehistoric people were thought to be nomadic, so they didn't really settle down and stay in one place. Because of this, there wasn't much of a reason to go to war. Resources weren't really seen as being one tribe or another tribe's possession, because in order to possess a river, for example, you'd have to live there and make sure that nobody else had access to it. However, in the Neolithic era, which is 10,000 BC to 2200 BC, tribes started to settle down into territories, which makes the potential for war breaking out much more probable in this time period. A lot of this remains speculation because there isn't enough evidence, but some of the proposed causes for war in the Stone Age would include disputes over territory, food, water, and even fights over women. I mean, think about it. If your average low IQ Chad is fighting his best friends over some random woman, imagine how an entire group of savage-ass mammoth-hunting cave gooners would behave. One terrible event that is speculated by historians to be caused by war is the Talheim Death Pit, which dates back to around 5000 BC. In this location, archaeologists found a pit filled with 34 bodies that looked like they were massacred. And if you include the outer ditch of the grave, there were 67 skeletons in total, all of which seem to have blunt force weapons used on their skull. In this site, researchers also found something that looks like a flat wooden paddle called a Thames beater. And no, cavemen weren't getting freaky with this thing. They used these glorified bonk sticks to baba booey their enemies into oblivion. Now, researchers have really only 2 theories about this event. One of them is that one village took over another to inhabit it. Another theory is that there was a small-scale civil war in the village, and just like Squid Game, the losers died. But they didn't just get their organs harvested here. The losers of this Stone Age battle ended up in a giant skeleton hole. And I'm not just talking about someone's freaky granny here. I'm talking about an enormous grave that looks like it was constructed for the Jolly Green Giant. Interestingly, only about 7 females aged 13 to 40 were found in the grave, which suggests that they may have been abducted. Besides the earlier weapons I mentioned, Neolithic fighters used axes and hammers made of wood, stone, and animal bones. Sometimes they even used farm tools that doubled as weapons. Talk about ingenuity. As we saw from the gravesite, Stone Age war was barbaric, brief, and brutal. And historians hypothesized they preferred guerrilla-style warfare, which, I'll be honest, sounds a lot better than doggy-style warfare. These wars likely either took place in resource hotspots like rivers, tribal villages, or luxury caveman real estate, such as a nice cave. If you think Vietnam-era guerrilla warfare is scary, imagine picking berries in a field somewhere around your village, and then out of nowhere, 200 cavemen incoherently yelling "Baba buoy, getting ready to spank your sorry ass with a glorified paddle that would make your bobsh's slipper feel like a down feather pillow. Doesn't sound fun to me. The Bronze Age. Now that we're in the Bronze Age, we certainly don't have to worry about a lack of evidence because this era has plenty of warfare to cover. In the Bronze Age, society began to see major civilizations starting to organize for the first time, and many historians view this as the dawn of warfare and conflict. Well, official warfare and conflict. As these societies grew more complex and organized, and especially without thousands of years of experience in trading and international business, when one civilization had resources that the other wanted, most leaders' best idea was just to wage war. What resources, you may ask? Well, to begin with, most of the Minecraft basics. Think land, metals, water, loot, and trade routes. Okay, trade routes aren't really in Minecraft, but you get the point. Anyways, quick tangent here, but most people don't consider the importance of rivers in ancient cities. Like all civilizations, rivers and access to water weren't just a want for a booming economy, they were a requirement. Rivers provided reliable access to scalable trade, drinking water, agriculture, and even seafood. And unlike most resources, you can't just trade a river. Thus, war was a natural consequence. One of the biggest wars that took place in the Bronze Age was the Battle of Kadesh. And by studying it, we can gain some insight into what war was like in this time period. But first, does anybody remember the story of Moses in the Bible? Well, the leader of the Battle of Kadesh was Ramses II, which is the same pharaoh from the story of Exodus in the Bible. Although it has been said this battle took place a couple decades before the time period of Exodus, when the pharaoh was younger and probably still better at fighting. You see, Ramses II wasn't happy with all of Egypt's L's in the past century, as Egypt was losing territory to its neighboring empires. So, like all ancient leaders who consider themselves to be gods, Pharaoh launched a wide-scale campaign to regain Egypt's lost territory to restore it to its former glory. Anyways, the Hittites didn't like this, so they made up their own army to counter the Egyptians heading for their land. This story gets long, so I'll try to summarize it the best I can. Two Hittite spies lied to the Egyptians and told them that their army was far away. And for some reason, the Egyptians totally believed them. The Egyptian army set up camp to chill for a bit. And then, a little while later, the Hittites straight up ambushed them. With no time to prepare, the Egyptians had to improvise with their strategy on the fly. And in a matter of minutes, the Hittite army pretty much broke the Egyptian army into pieces. Now, once the Hittites saw that the army was broken up, they got greedy and started plundering the nearby enemy camps for that sweet Egyptian loot. Now, at this point, I'm guessing Ramses was feeling embarrassed and upset because somehow, against all odds, he escaped from the Hittites surrounding him and reunited with his army. This was probably possible because the Egyptians had lighter and more maneuverable chariots, which gave them a huge competitive advantage in battle over the Hittites' heavy chariots, which probably had the modern-day acceleration equivalent of a Mitsubishi Mirage. Now, I know all of this because Ramses II actually had hundreds of fanboys who sat around all day writing poems about him, like the ancient equivalent of a K-pop stan. Either way though, I respect the rulers in this time period because they actually fought with their army in the battles that they waged, which is pretty cool if you ask me, because no world leaders do that anymore. In the end, it was speculated that nobody really won this battle on either side. Apparently, the war created the world's first peace treaty though, which is pretty cool. If you were fighting a war at this point in history, you'd better hope that you had a good army because without it, you'd probably be killed by a stray arrow in a matter of minutes. Now that we're no longer in the Stone Age, we have a significant upgrade in our weapons. When talking about weapons in this era, keep in mind that the invention of bronze armor and the bow and arrow changed warfare strategies significantly. For example, if you were a soldier in an ancient Egyptian war, you had to keep your eyes peeled for bowmen and flying arrows at all times. Warfare at the beginning of the Bronze Age was pretty similar to the end of the Stone Age. But even when they did come around to the invention of metal weapons such as the bronze axe, bronze did not always equal better. For example, for most of this time period, most societies still didn't make arrow tips out of bronze because bronze arrow tips were duller than obsidian and more expensive than bone arrow tips. Furthermore, they didn't want to bother spending money on an arrowhead that would probably end up never found again. And as far as other weapons went, a flint mace or axe blow was just as damaging as a strike from a copper one. Because of these reasons, copper knives and swords still coexisted alongside stone, bludgeons, and arrowheads for a long time in the Bronze Age. Warfare was much more organized and strategic than the Stone Age. Armies would use advanced melee formations such as the phalanx, where soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder using shields for protection and striking their enemies with spears and swords. I think we need to talk about how cool chariots were at this point. For example, in the Battle of Kadesh, chariots were a relatively new technology, only having been invented a couple centuries into the Bronze Age. Chariots were basically the world's first car, with only 2 horsepower. And just like modern-day cars, chariot technology improved over time. For example, at some point in history, the lighter 2-wheel chariot was a new design that made it faster and more maneuverable. than the earlier models. Also, keep in mind that chariots were considered the cool vehicle back then, and most normies in battle didn't even get one. In this era, fortified cities became more common, and with that came the dawn of siege warfare, where the enemies of your kingdom would use battering rams and ladders to try to bypass your city's defenses, and you would have probably been instructed to shoot them with bows and arrows or throw hot boiling oil and stones at them while they try to climb their ladders. Battles in the Bronze Age typically took place in plains and open fields. Was this because everyone became more civilized than simply resorting to guerrilla warfare tactics? No. The leaders of the battles probably just wanted to make sure that there was enough room to do victory donuts in their sweet new chariots after winning the fight. The Iron Age. Well, now we're in the Iron Age, and unsurprisingly, just like the Bronze Age, the Iron Age is categorized by iron. Historians weren't really creative with making these names. In this time period, war was primarily fought over control of resources, as usual, although the definition of valuable resources changed slightly. You see, at every point up until now, fertile land and water was fought for. But now that most people had learned a thing or two about metal forging, valuable minerals like iron were in high demand. Add to this the fact that various religious sects were doing a not very good job at coexisting. While it isn't agreed upon how legitimate it was as an actual event, one famous war that supposedly took place in this time period and has pretty strong evidence for it happening was the Trojan War, a battle between Greece and Troy from the 12th century BC. This battle allegedly broke out after Paris of Troy kidnapped Helen, the wife of the Spartan king Menelaus. Talk about low, dude. Anyways, war in the Iron Age was categorized by double-edged iron swords, spears with iron tips, and even daggers. They used shields constructed of wood and leather, and metal maces. Ouch. Like the other time periods, they used advanced formations in war, making a turtle shell type shape with soldiers' shields. Defensively, cities were within very guarded walls, which might sound like a good idea until you realize that enemies could lay siege on you at any moment. And without water or food coming in, the odds of survival under siege got lowered every single day. Enemies of your city would even build towers to jump the wall, or tunnel under the wall to get within your kingdom. The Iron Age shared a lot of similarities with the Bronze Age, just with some minor and some major developments. The medieval era. In the medieval era, war was waged by monarchs and nobles to gain either political power or to expand their territory. If you've been following along in this video, you've probably noticed a common theme. One of the biggest wars in the medieval period was the Crusades, which in a nutshell were organized by Western European Christians after centuries of Muslim wars of expansion. In the Crusades, the primary objective was to stop the expansion of the Muslim states and reclaim the Holy Land in the Middle East for Christianity, and recapture previously Christian territories. During the medieval era, weapons advanced a lot. Notable weapons of this time period include longswords, lances, which could be thrown from far away, and the Morning Star, which is not as friendly as it sounds. This was a spiky ball on a chain that was designed for crushing knights' armor. Also, they didn't just have mere bows anymore. They had crossbows, which had a huge range advantage, and could even pierce a knight's plate armor. Trebuchets existed too, but unless you were an idiot who got in the way of the projectile path, or you lived in a city that it was being aimed at, they weren't really something to worry about. You could probably just run to the side of the field, and it wouldn't be able to adjust its aim fast enough. Battles in medieval times were not as chaotic as their depictions in movies and story. As one Redditor pointed out, if you stayed in your crowd, keeping your enemy only in front of you while being surrounded by your friends left, right, and behind, your chances of survival increased heavily. Disciplined and organized shield formations allowed smaller armies to hold off much larger forces than they should have been able to, with coordination and skilled teamwork. Additionally, a small group known as the Charge Cavalry, which consisted of heavily armored knights on armored horses, would break into enemy lines, allowing the rest of the army to seep into the cracks of the battle line in order to divide up the army into smaller groups. Men in most medieval wars throughout history were arranged in the most natural formation, also known as the line formation. The larger the battle is, the more important it was to keep the line together. Shock troops, which were knights with lances, swords, and shields, were intended to break enemy ranks and shatter the infantry. And that is why the battle formation we mentioned earlier were used. Keeping your shields tight to hold the line was the #1 determinant of whether or not you would lose a war. And believe it or not, this was a shock to me, evidence shows that the winners of medieval wars often suffered very minimal casualties. Siege was also an integral part of war at this time, with armies relying heavily on catapults, battering rams, and siege towers. Another tactic that was used that we mentioned earlier was cutting off supplies to the castle that was being besieged. In reality though, medieval warfare was rough. Regardless of ideals of chivalry, the wars in the medieval era were just as or more savage than the ones from previous eras. This is because medieval times were still a transitional period to more structured forms of war. Early modern era. In this time period, military conquest was one way in which monarchs and empires looked to acquire new land and further spread their wings. Wars were fought for all the same reasons as the last, as well as fights for political power struggles between emerging dynasties and nation states, as well as the desire for economic trading dominance. Events such as the War War of the Spanish Succession comprised one such cause. In this age, there were many skirmishes between Catholics and Protestants in Europe. Additionally, one famous war from this period was the 30 Years' War, from 1618 to 1648. The 30-Year War was one of the most catastrophic wars in European history. What started as a religious conflict between Protestant and Catholic states within the Holy Roman Empire was soon enlarged into a border dispute involving some of the greatest powers in Europe. This war brought widespread famine, disease, and depopulation, especially in the German states. In 1648, the war finally ended with a treaty known as the Peace of Westphalia. What was war like in the early modern era? Well, the introduction and wide usage of gunpowder weapons pretty much defined war in the early modern era. Muskets, cannons, and other firearms completely changed the nature of combat and rendered most medieval techniques, such as cavalry charges, completely useless. Many battles were characterized by vast formations of troops and a strategy known as the pike and shot, where musketeers fired a bunch of shots while pikemen protected them from enemy cavalry. So basically, it was spawn camping. Heavy artillery like cannons were mainly used in sieges because they could easily break through fortified city walls. Sieges were frequent, as many armies sought to take cities and fortresses of the most strategic importance, sometimes leading to long, exhausting standoffs. Like I mentioned, this time period saw the development of gunpowder weapons. The musket replaced both swords and bows as the primary infantry weapon. Cannons were also used in combat because of their ability to reduce fortifications, essentially destroying them from a safe distance. The first musket was the matchlock musket, but over time it was improved into the flintlock musket because flint was far more reliable. Gunpowder not only influenced the weapons, but also the battle styles of this time period. This change led to linear infantry formations where soldiers stood in a relatively long, straight line to have as much firepower from their muskets as possible. Cavalry units were still sometimes used, although the invention of muskets made soldiers way less privy to undergoing these strategies. And unlike the last era, urban warfare became much more frequent, as developed cities rose to political and economic prominence, like Vienna and Paris. Like mentioned previously, during sieges, food supplies would typically run low, and everyone, including soldiers and civilians, had to survive on whatever was available to eat. Thus, many of them resorted to eating rats, horses, and dogs, and in some cases, entire towns starved to death during extended sieges. The modern era and present day. Modern day, here we go. In the modern era, ideological confrontations came at the forefront of wars, especially during the Cold War, where the clash between capitalism and communism led to numerous proxy wars worldwide. New reasons for war and conflict included oil and other energy commodities and the drive for industrial power. Wars in the 19th and 20th centuries had many examples of disputes over nationalism, self-determination, independence movements, the American Civil War, and decolonization struggles in Africa and Asia. Additionally, warfare in the 21st century saw the rise of terrorism motivated by extremist ideologies and regional grievances. The biggest war in the modern era, of course, was World War II. World War II, from 1939 to 1945, determined the fate of the modern-day world. This war was driven by expansionist ambitions, especially those from Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Thus, it naturally clashed with the polar opposite ideologies of fascism and democracy. This war saw countless major battles reverberating throughout Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. And as we all know, it ended with the defeat of the Axis powers and the toppling of the fascist regime, which established the United States of America and the Soviet Union as superpowers in the transitional period into the Cold War. What was war like in the modern era? Modern warfare with today's advanced technologies includes firearms, tanks, aircraft, and missiles, and of course, nuclear weapons. Contemporary wars use any number of variations in attack style, sometimes combining traditional military battle structure with guerrilla warfare.
They're in the tree!
And in the modern day, rifles and handguns are standard weapons to every soldier. Howitzers provide long-range firepower, and missiles, both cruise and ballistic, provide precision strikes against enemy targets. The invention of nuclear weapons opened an entirely new scale of destructive capability that changed the tide, context, and rules of war forever. Recently, cyber warfare tools have been added to the game as well, allowing enemy forces to intercept military secrets, gain intel, and even turn electricity off to enemies via EMPs. Additionally, drones have changed the game in modern battles, such as the FPV bombing drones currently being used in the Ukraine war. Besides this, for battles that take place in 2024, for the first time in history, it's pretty much a prerequisite to be fighting on air, land, and sea. Bonus: the future. This is a new one. In any of our time period videos, we have never covered on a hypothetical future, but for this video, I figured, why not try it out? With that being said, we've covered every era of history we know. What about the final era, the future era? Well, although I'm no time traveler, this is just fictional speculation, but in the future, it is possible that physical land and sovereignty will give way to fighting over digital control and power. In dictatorial countries, this would probably include power over free speech and the suppression of controversial information. Besides this, however, wars will be fought for many reasons. reasons. Because at this point, we've progressed so far that any reason we fought a war in the past will probably happen again. Future reasons for war, however, could also include future resources that we don't even know about yet. I'll leave you with a hypothetical to help paint the picture. Imagine the year is 2200. Nowadays, oil money is a thing of the distant past. Up until this point, the most sought after resource was lithium, but a recent breakthrough in supercapacitors makes them the new perfect storage for energy. They can be charged for a single second, last for weeks to months, and hold unimaginable amounts of power in a tiny amount of volume. Basically like Tony Stark's nuclear reactor. After outstanding research reports were released from the once Ivy League Musk University, Elon Musk's research and innovation-oriented university founded in 2045, regarding this new invention, it was an absolute sensation around the world, and even more consequential than the invention of the light bulb. However, there's only one problem with this new technology. The new supercapacitor technology that everyone wants requires a rare mineral called potentia that is currently only found in a little island known as Mergui, formerly known as Fiji. In an interesting twist of fate, nuclear weapons have become completely obsolete, as long before Iran and Afghanistan gained power to nuclear weaponry in 2036, the United Nations pooled billions of dollars into research and development for nuclear defense weapons. The technology that came from this was able to deactivate any and all ICBMs by sending supersonic counter missiles at a nearly unlimited number of missiles. And by 2080, nearly all countries in the world have a nuclear iron dome of mutually assured protection. Because of this, and paired with the new breakthroughs in technology to counter radiation and EMFs, warfare reverts back to something like the World War II era of war, but still far more futuristic. In this warfare, close-range combat is relevant again, and ingenuity gives nations a competitive advantage. Thus, this new supercapacitor was the new holy grail for super advanced combat weapons. From looking back in history, we can conclude that a futuristic war for resources would be far different from the historical examples we've covered thus far. In fact, war might never get waged in the first place in this example, as advanced geospecific information warfare could be utilized first to either keep it from happening in the first place or brainwash the citizens of Mergui to uprise until their government makes a deal that's in favor of the country that's conducting the brainwashing. This is all a future hypothetical, but I wanted to get you guys' thoughts on it because I think this format could be kind of fun. The craziest battles in human history. No, not epic rap battles of history, the craziest battles of history. In this video, I'm going to discuss battles that were crazy and undoubtedly had an impact on history. Let's get started. The year is 1204 AD. You are an ambitious leader with the sole goal of unifying all of Mongolia under a single banner, bringing together all of the nomadic tribes into one mega civilization, something that has never been done before. Your life has not been easy. Since birth, your life has been a cycle of life and death, with almost everybody you know being involved in battle and dying. This brutal lifestyle was relatively normal for the tribes living in the Mongolian steppe, although it doesn't make it any easier. Through focus and sheer dedication, you have become an extremely powerful leader, and you are close to achieving your goal of unifying all of Mongolia, with now only one obstacle standing in your way. Another great Mongolian warrior named Jamaka, a leader who holds almost opposite values to yours, with the goal of preserving tradition and keeping historic practices alive, specifically focusing on family ties. This opposing leader was also one of your childhood best friends, and someone you considered to be a blood brother, someone who brought stability and joy to your life. Someone who, unfortunately, over the years you had grown apart from due to ideological differences. And now, this battle in which you are about to embark on is the conclusion of your long brewing rivalry, and will solidify a massive change not only in the history of Mongolia, but also in the history of the world. Today is the day you find yourself standing in a battlefield. You and your army are slowly approaching a much larger army, an army that is led by Jamaka. It's hard to not feel confident when you have an army of 66,000 trained warriors. However, when your enemy outnumbers you by multiples, you need to get creative. While your army begins to approach the army of the enemy, you signal your army to spread out as wide as possible, not only to make your army appear larger than it is, but also to subconsciously encourage the enemy army to do the exact same. As the armies approach closer and closer, you have two extremely long lines of warriors headed directly at each other. And all of a sudden, you signal your entire army with the blow of a horn, a signal you taught them months prior. And at that point, your army collapses from a long army into a narrow, almost arrow formation penetrating the enemy line. This strategy was extremely effective and almost instantly shattered any strategy that Jamaka's army had, and now they are clueless clueless in trying to pick up the pieces. During this bloodshed and confusion, the leaders of the opposing force, including Jamaica, fled, leaving their soldiers essentially abandoned. And it was at this point when you and your army killed who you had to and capture all who were willing to submit. As the sun sets and the dust settles, you reflect on the epic battle that you just embarked on, now with an army that is double the size that you started with. And due to this battle, you are well on your way to unifying the Mongolian people, the goal that started this entire battle in the beginning. And this long-lasting feud with Jamaica, your ex-childhood best friend and current arch-nemesis. The outcome of this battle and unified people led to a seemingly unstoppable army, and the victor of the Battle of the 13 Sides. And what you and your army would go on to achieve would become known as the largest contiguous army in all of human history. And you, who formerly would be known as Temujin, would go on to solidify your name as Genghis Khan. For me, this battle is crazy for a lot of reasons. Not only is it the story of a modest army literally dividing and conquering a much larger army, but it also is essentially the origin story of Genghis Khan, at least as we know him today. Obviously, his younger self, Temujin, has a super interesting and long backstory as well, but that's beyond the scope of this video, specifically about epic battles. And with the birth of Genghis Khan and this new unified Mongolia, we also see the birth of the Mongolian Empire, which, like I mentioned, is the largest contiguous empire in all of history. At its peak, the Mongol Empire ruled over 23.5 million square kilometers of land, or just under 10 million square miles of land, which is insane. Starting with just one man from humble beginnings in the foothills of Mongolia to conquering almost all of Asia and even parts of Europe and the Middle East. For better or for worse, Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire was a force to be reckoned with. And the Battle of the 13 Sides was definitely a catalyst for everything that the Mongol Empire was able to achieve. Oh, and in case you were curious, Jamaica, who was able to flee this battle, was later captured and executed. So yeah, not only did fleeing not save his life, it also very likely lost him the battle. This was a pretty crazy battle with some pretty crazy implications, but we're only just getting started. Let's move over a bit west and go a little bit further back in time to discuss an army that was extremely outnumbered and a battle that was fought by an extremely iconic leader, someone you're definitely gonna recognize. Let's dive right in. The year is 331 BC, and you are standing in Gaugamela, which today is known as Iraq. And you are a great leader from Macedon, an ancient Greek kingdom. And while living over 2,000 years ago, your name still inspires fear to whoever hears it. Your name is Alexander the Great, and you are fighting a seemingly impossible battle. You have an army of 47,000 experienced and trained soldiers, but standing against you in this battlefield is the army of Darius III, the Persian king of kings, and his army of 200,000 dwarfs your skilled yet small army. It is believed that a majority of this large army is essentially underskilled. However, there is strength in numbers, and there is still a good amount of extremely well-trained soldiers included in this massive army fighting for the Persians. This isn't the first time that you, Alexander the Great, are fighting Darius III. However, this battle that we are about to begin is likely the craziest and most important. Previous to this war, you were already campaigning in the Persians' territory to conquer Persia, and obviously Darius was unhappy about this. But with your unwavering dedication to conquer the Persian land, it was only a matter of time until this battle between you and Darius took place. The last battle that you had with Darius 2 years prior, you were victorious in, although Darius was able to escape. And that is something that you're unsatisfied with. And due to the massive size of the Persian Empire, over that 2-year span, Darius was able to reclaim and rebuild an entirely new army, which is exactly who you are fighting today. The battle begins, and the Persian army sends hundreds of chariots directly at your infantry units. The light infantry units were able to bombard the Persian chariots with bows and arrows, slowing them down and weakening their numbers, to the point that when the chariots approached the units further back in your army, they were already significantly damaged. Interestingly, the chariots that were able to survive were able to not only approach your army, but also pass your army and get behind them. But instead of exploiting this vulnerable position that they had just exposed, they instead decided to make a run to your base camp to loot it, which was definitely short-sighted because this led the army much weaker than it needed to be. Like, just imagine you're standing there, you see horses and chariots essentially rushing your position, and as you're huddled there behind your sword and shield, all you hear is the horse running at you and then running by you. and then you turn around and look and you see that they're still going and still going. Now that the Persians' front line was distracted and essentially gone, their army's lack of experience was exposed, and so was their king. And it was at that point when you and your army go for the kill. You and your top soldiers approach King Darius directly, head on. And as you slaughter his army to get closer and closer to him, you notice that he not only steps back, but begins to retreat. Now, unfortunately, as much as you likely wanted to chase him down and execute him yourself, you simply weren't able to, and it was not strategic. However, the retreat of the Persian king led to a mass retreat of the Persian army, completely eliminating their number advantage. Of course, you still had work to do eliminating the soldiers that were able to get past your defenses initially, but at this point, your victory was already secured. With King Darius III nowhere to be found, and the majority of the army eliminated or also on the run, you now had free reign to achieve your goal of conquering the Persian Empire, after ending up victorious in the Battle of Gaugamela. The one battle that ended the Persian Empire. A battle that undoubtedly had a large impact on human history, as Alexander was able to go on and spread Greek ideals and culture across the, at that point, known world. It just makes you think, what if Alexander the Great had lost that battle? I knew I had to put these two stories next to each other just because of, at least to me, the similarities that they had. First of all, being the underdog story, having a much smaller army but still coming out victorious. Secondly, both of these battles involving iconic historic leaders, for better or for worse. And the fact that both of these battles ended in a significant impact on the course of history. Alexander the Great and King Darius definitely weren't childhood best friends, but during this battle, they were definitely mortal enemies. And if you look into some of the other battles that they had previously, it'd be pretty obvious to know why. A small example would be the previous battle they had before this battle of Gargamel, known as the Battle of Isius, ended with a loss for King Darius, but also the capture of his wife, his mother, and his two daughters, and the control of southern Asia, specifically modern-day Turkey. So yeah, for the Battle of Gargamel, King Darius was definitely coming back for blood, and I think that's kind of shown by the army of literally over 200,000 soldiers, at least estimated. But yeah, I just find this battle so crazy, and despite being heavily outnumbered, the army of the Macedon emerged victorious due to its obviously superior tactics and pretty clever use of its troops. Whether this was good or bad, I have no input on. I'm referencing these from a historical matter. That being said, let's move on to our next battle. The year is 202 BC. You are currently the most popular living man in Rome, and after campaigning in Spain and coming back to Rome, you, while technically ineligible, become the governor of Sicily, which is a huge deal. And you are at the tail end of the Second Punic War, a war between two extremely powerful ancient civilizations, Rome and Carthage. Carthage was a city in North Africa, and they were inspired by Rome and wanted to control trade and land, just like Rome did. The most famous person from Carthage was a man named Hannibal, who led an army of over 40,000 men and literal war elephants from Spain all the way into Italy, going through the Alps, which alone is an insane feat, but that's really only where it begins. After this deadly voyage, they were able to essentially sneak attack the Romans and win some pretty significant battles, like the Battle of Cannae. Hannibal and his army was able to occupy a small part of Italy for almost 16 years, and definitely annoying, but not necessarily damaging Rome itself. So the Romans didn't put their full effort into destroying Hannibal just yet. That's where you come in. Your name is Scipio Africanus. You wanted to put an end to this Hannibal guy once and for all. And while the higher government really wasn't willing to support you in terms of troops, your fame and popularity was able to gather you a large army of volunteers. From these volunteer campaigns, you were able to gather over 7,000 pretty qualified soldiers, many of which were veterans who fought against Hannibal in the Italian countryside and was also fed up with his shenanigans, to say the least. This is where the battle we are about to discuss begins. A battle known as the Battle of Zama. The battle begins with this modest army invading North Africa, with the intention of drawing Hannibal back out of Rome and into Carthage, which was a success. Once Hannibal had returned, he had put together an army that I could only describe as terrifying. Your plan worked perfectly, and Hannibal returned. Unfortunately, he returned with a vengeance and began to put together an army that you couldn't even begin to imagine. The front line of this army that you're about to engage consisted of war elephants, literally an entire line of war elephants. Behind these roughly 80 war elephants stood roughly 4,000 cavalry and 36,000 infantry units, a massive army to say the least. However, you didn't come unprepared either. You, once again, had a modest army, at least comparatively, but you weren't completely outnumbered. Your army consisted of around 24,000 infantry units and 6,000 cavalry units. The battle began from the Carthage side, and you notice a group of war elephants running from the front line, and they're not necessarily running directly at you. They're running in your direction, but slowly turning and turning until they actually run back into their own army. And this is the beginning of the end. It begins to cause a massive disruption within the Carthage army. You instantly instantly command part of your army to take advantage of this huge distraction and begin to attack their vulnerable army that is currently being trampled by their own elephants. It was at this point where you see the other elements from the enemy front line begin running at your army, and this is something you had planned for. These elephants approach your army but don't run directly into your army, they run into the gaps that your army had made for them, where at that point your army was able to attack and neutralize these battle elephants, which were essentially used as early versions of tanks or battering rams at the very least. After this, it was a face-off of the cavalry, and the Carthaginian and the Roman cavalry met in the center of the battlefield and resulted in a retreat of Hannibal's and your cavalry chasing directly behind them, leaving only the infantry units behind. Left on the battlefield is your 23,000 troops versus Hannibal's 36,000, and you're on enemy turf. The infantry battle was intense and resulted in your first line of men essentially holding off the first line of the enemy troops until there was an opening for your men to begin the battle. However, as your first two lines of defense were able to essentially eliminate the first two lines of the Carthaginian defense, you now have one line of men that are injured and tired at best. And Hannibal still has his final line of defense, which was his most experienced, most talented, and completely fresh army, which hadn't even lifted a finger yet in this entire battle. At this point, you begin to get extremely worried and question if it's even possible that you can win this battle. Sure, their first two lines of defense were eliminated, but now you have an extremely tired and injured army, and they have an untouched line of assassins essentially. So at this point, it doesn't matter that now the numbers have essentially been even, because their numbers were stronger than your numbers. It was at this point when you call your men to retreat and you reorganize them. You put all of your men into one line and put your weakest men in the middle and the strongest on the outside. There wasn't much opportunity for any real strategy or clever tricks. It was an all-out bloodbath, and your army fought Hannibal's army face on, fighting brutally and neither army giving up an inch of space. Their men's obvious experience and lack of wounds was showing, and this battle was not looking good for Rome at all. And you, Scipio, were beginning to assume the worst, when all of a sudden you hear something in the distance that is about to change the course of history. Dashing directly at Hannibal's army from behind was your cavalry units, the same cavalry units that were essentially drawn away by their cavalry units. And they were coming to your rescue as, shortly after chasing their cavalry units, they realized that the point of their cavalry units retreating was to draw them out of the battlefield, to allow their more trained infantry to clean up the Roman army. Ironically, this sort of maneuver was something that Hannibal was known for, and it is a bit ironic that this is the maneuver that led to his downfall. It was at this point that Rome forced Carthage into peace and turned them essentially into a client state. After this war, Carthage had to give up all of its power, land, and resources to Rome, and this led Rome to become one of the most powerful forces in the region and in history ever. And this victory was also a huge step for Rome becoming the massive empire that we still discuss to this day. So yeah, congratulations on you and your men. But this story is undoubtedly crazy. It's wild to think that this battle is only one of many battles in the Punic Wars, and as much as I would love to talk about those, it really goes beyond the scope of this entire video. But if you guys are interested in a video on the craziest wars ever, then we could discuss that. But for the sake of this video, focusing on battles, let's focus back in on the Battle of Zama. I swear I didn't intend on this video being full of underdog stories, but don't be surprised if you're watching this video and the title is The Greatest Underdog Stories in Battle or something along those lines, because honestly, who doesn't love a good underdog story? This battle specifically has a lot of elements of fairy tale battles that just make it so cool. The unlikely leader that rose through the ranks and was able to essentially build his own militia outside of the government, his ambitious plan to take down an entire country, and the noble goal of defeating the person that has been more or less of a nuisance on their home turf for 16 years. That person being Hannibal in Italy, of course. Scipio was undoubtedly a badass, and I'm honestly surprised I haven't heard about him sooner, but I definitely enjoyed learning about his rise to power and this specific victorious battle, where he and Rome were victorious. I also love how part of this underdog story is literally the fact that Rome used Hannibal's war tactics against him once and for all. Like literally after this battle, Carthage was wiped off the face of the earth. But it does make you think though, what if Rome had lost this battle? What would have happened? Hannibal was already on Rome's territory, and they did have a relatively strong army. If Rome hadn't won this battle, there's a chance that we would have never had the Roman Empire. And if that was the case, the world that we live in today would be extremely different. Our language, culture, architecture, money, laws, and so many other things come directly from the Roman Empire. And with this battle potentially being the catalyst of the Roman Empire's success, I think it's safe to say that this battle definitely had an impact on history and that it was undoubtedly a crazy battle. If for no other reason than having war elephants, which is honestly badass. So that's at least 1 point for Hannibal. War elephants, that's pretty sick. Although, as cruel as they were ultimately part of their downfall. But I digress. Before we move on to the last battle of this list, I want to make a quick point. Obviously, there is no possible way for me to include every crazy battle throughout history, and if you think that this list is missing an important battle, I'm right there with you. And I encourage you to please drop a comment below about your favorite battle and why you think it deserves a spot on the next list. I say next list because doing research for this video caused me to come up with a plethora of entries that I just couldn't fit on this list. However, if you guys are interested in another video about epic battles throughout history that changed history, please let me know in the comments by saying you want part 2 or even suggesting battles that you think I missed in this video. Now, let's discuss the final battle of this video. And for this last battle, let's go a bit more modern, at least comparatively to these other entries. A battle that is involved in a war that is of personal interest to myself, and I'm assuming many of you guys as well. The year is 1943, and you are a soldier for the Soviet Union, fighting under a man named Joseph Stalin, a person who is not a good person, but he's a better boss than the enemy you're fighting against. This is the Battle of Stalingrad. As a soldier in Stalingrad, you are informed that Germany is planning not only an attack, but a complete takeover of Stalingrad, and over 200,000 Soviet men were sent to slow Germany's advance. All 200,000 of those men died trying to slow Germany's advance. After hearing reports of those men losing their life and the German advance still heading your way, morale was beginning to slip. And before you could even think about what the next plan would be, you hear something from above. It's a German Luftwaffe, a fire attack, dropping bombs all over Stalingrad, making a majority of the city rubble and dust. You and your remaining comrades brace for impact as you know that this is only the beginning of a battle, not the end. And soon, you see a German army advance on your position, a position that is extremely compromised. For months, the Germans essentially flooded the destroyed city to continue the battle, and this pile of rubble essentially went from a town to a meat grinder. With things beginning to look even more bleak, if that was even possible, the Soviets had one more trick up their sleeve, and the timing couldn't have been any better. It was a Soviet winter. It was also at this point when the Soviets had come up with the plan to not face the Germans head on, but to try to surround them, which they were successfully able to do, and you and your comrades were able to not only eliminate German soldiers, but circle them, closing them off from any sort of resupplies, which was extremely deadly, as now the Germans were standing in the rubble that they had created, surrounded by Soviets, with absolutely no way of gaining new supplies, or at this point, even intelligence. And with winter arriving, this German army, which was abandoned by Hitler, was left to essentially wither away. Many of these German soldiers froze to death or simply died due to starvation. After enough time had gone on where you and your troops believed that the Germans had to have been snuffed out, you and a group of comrades go to revisit Stalingrad one last time, preparing for a battle, but not sure what you were going to see. Walking through the rubble, you see only emaciated, dead German soldiers and realize that this was successful. And the Soviet victory of this battle was a huge landmark in the downfall of Nazi Germany. It wasn't the final nail in the coffin, but it was one of the first nails in the coffin, for sure. So yeah, not only was this battle extremely deadly, disgusting, and more brutal than we could probably ever even imagine, it's on this list for 2 reasons. 1, obviously because of the historical impact, and 2, because of the sheer numbers. The Battle of Stalingrad is not only one of the deadliest and biggest battles in World War II, but also one of the deadliest and biggest battles of all time. And for that reason, I definitely thought I would talk about it in this video. If you know anything about World War II, then you know that the Soviets paid a massive price for their efforts in World War II, in the form of tens of millions of their soldiers. And while their efforts were extremely helpful in defeating the Germans, it did come with that human cost. And this battle is a great example of that. Germans wanted Stalingrad so badly because it was a big industrial city, and it was a key to controlling that region, something that Germany was definitely interested in. Stalin obviously wanted to protect Stalingrad because it was an important city and also because it held his name, something that meant a lot to him. The Battle of Stalingrad was a huge turning point for the war. Not only did it stop Germany's advance into the Soviet Union, but it also gave the US and Britain more hope, which was much needed at this point. After this battle, the Germans began losing more and more, and the Soviets were even able to push them all the way back into Germany, a place that they had at that point expanded far out of. This battle is only a small glimpse into the sheer determination that the Soviet army had, even when fighting in terrible conditions, and how powerful it was in the ultimate destruction of Nazi-occupied Germany. The craziest prison escapes of all time. The Alcatraz escape. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, better known as Alcatraz, is likely the most iconic prison in the entire world. Alcatraz sits on top of a small island in the San Francisco Bay and started its life in the 1850s as a military fort, and then was converted to a military prison in the 1910s. And in the 1930s, the United States Department of Justice bought the military prison and turned it into what we know it as today, a former maximum security federal prison. Alcatraz was notorious for a couple of reasons. Both of those reasons prisons being extremely tied together. For starters, it was notorious because it was literally seen as an escape-proof prison. And that was because it combined the highest level technology possible within the walls of this prison, and it also coupled that with timeless prehistoric technology outside of the prison walls. What I mean by that is the literal mile of rough, shark-infested water surrounding the prison, making it extremely unique and almost one of a kind. Because sure, being inside a maximum security prison with all of the bells and whistles is one thing, but having all of those in combination with being on a remote island surrounded by rough, shark-infested water is just a whole nother level. And that is partially what made Alcatraz so famous. But obviously, they don't build these prisons for great people. These federal maximum security prisons exist for a reason, which brings us to the second reason why this prison was so notorious. It was home to some of the most infamous criminals of its time. For example, Al Capone, George Machine Gun Kelly, Alvin Karpis, and a bunch of others. So yeah, it's safe to assume that Alcatraz was likely the one prison that nobody could escape from. And from 1933 until 1962, that was considered true. There was multiple escape attempts, but none that were considered successful. That was until June 11th of 1962, when three men would cause not only national headlines, but also an ongoing mystery that still puzzles the world to this very day. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers were lifelong criminals, and by the time they had ended up at Alcatraz, they were no strangers to escape attempts. Frank Morris started his criminal career at the age of 13 and lived a life of crime primarily consisting of drugs and robbery. And throughout his time being in and out of the system, he had escaped multiple times from multiple different correctional facilities. He was likely able to escape due to his extremely high intelligence, and is recorded to have an IQ of 133, which is in the top 2% of the general population. But unfortunately, he decided to use his powers for evil. On the other hand, the Anglin brothers, John and Clarence, didn't start their criminal career much later. Clarence was caught breaking into a service station when he was only 14 years old, and the brothers began robbing banks together not long after. They too had multiple escape attempts and successful escapes on their record, which may not come as a surprise considering the context of this video. Now that we have all of the information, one question still remains. What happens when you mix an inescapable prison with criminals that cannot be contained? Well, the answer lies in the following story. A story that is shrouded in irony, because sure, why wouldn't you want to have all of the extremely dangerous bad guys in one place? Well, because then you have all of the bad guys in one place where they can work together. And that is exactly what happened. Frank Morris, John Anglin, Clarence Anglin, and Alan West actually knew each other from previous convictions in Florida and Georgia. I guess you really are the sum of the 5 people you hang out with. Regardless, with all of their histories of prison escapes, it didn't take long for them to begin plotting their escape from Alcatraz, the prison that you're supposedly not able to escape. And after coming together to join forces, they come up with a plan to escape. And this plan starts by chipping away at cement. Oh, and if you're curious why I didn't mention Alan West earlier, you'll see why later. Just trust me. Obviously, being in a maximum security prison leaves minimal opportunities for easy escapes. But these criminals identified the weakest point of their cell being not the door, but the vent that was hidden under everybody's sink. And for a 6-month period, all 4 of these men begin widening the ducts beneath their sinks using saw blades, metal spoons, electric drill bits, anything they could get their hands on that would chip away at the cement. Now this alone brings up 2 questions. How did they hide the hole, and how did they cover the sound of chipping away at cement? Well, 2 simple answers. In regards to how they would hide chipping away at the hole, first of all, these men would take turn being on guard, watching for the guards that would typically only do their hourly patrol, but sometimes would do spontaneous patrols as well, where they would need to obviously make sure that the guards did not see them digging these holes. And once their daily digging session was complete, how they concealed them from the guards throughout the rest of the day when they weren't digging them was actually quite clever. All of these men made papier-mâché replicas of the vent and surrounding wall area, painted in the same color as the wall, from paint that one of these men stole from their prison job. How they covered the noise of digging was because one of the men actually played the accordion, and during music hour was the perfect opportunity to quickly and loudly bang away at the cement. Now, after roughly 6 months of digging, all of these men had access to what was behind their wall. And obviously, this hole just didn't go outside. It led to a gap between the walls, consisting primarily of pipes. This unguarded utility area between cells was the perfect place to assess the situation. And once these men had access to this corridor, they climbed the pipes and found the closest exit they could find, which happened to be a vacant top-level cell block where they set up a secret workshop. The men weren't going to be escaping at this point in time, but they were getting extremely close to their great escape. In this vacant cell block, the men identified identified their escape route, which was a ceiling vent that they would need to pry open, but for them, that was no big task. And they spent the next few months bringing supplies up to their secret workshop, specifically raincoats, glues, magazines, pieces of plywood, anything that would be helpful and useful for their escape. Over time, the men were beginning to stitch together raincoats to build a makeshift raft and putting together pieces of plywood to make makeshift paddles, and also reading magazines about water safety and mechanics to help educate themselves on the best way to essentially act on the water and make something to potentially float across the water. It was really quite ingenious. And once they had their raft, paddle, and escape vent pried open, they were ready to make their escape. Around 10 p.m. on June 11th, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers got out of their bed, put replica papier-mâché heads into their bed to make it appear that they were still in bed, and met up together in their secret workshop, where they grabbed their raft, broke the ceiling vent, and began their escape. These men climbed out of the vent on the ceiling onto the roof of Alcatraz, and then descended 50 feet off of the prison roof onto the prison grounds, hauling all of their gear while sliding down a kitchen vent pipe. The men somehow avoided the sniper towers and outdoor guards and climbed the 12-foot barbed wire fences and planted their boat in water on the shore that was a blind spot to searchlights and gun towers. And at that point, they had inflated their raft with an accordion and set sail. And the three of these men were never seen again. Now you might be asking yourself, wait, the three of these men? What happened to the fourth man? Well, Alan West wasn't as lucky as the other criminals. And on the night of the escape, when West tried to remove the papier-mâché concrete concoction that was covering the hole in the wall, he couldn't. The concrete that he had used to temporarily hold the vent in place during the day had hardened. And by the time he finally got the vent off and was able to make it to the secret workshop, the rest of the men were gone. And West simply accepted his fate and went back to his cell where he went to bed. That story alone is insane, and it's still not over yet. The three men had essentially made the perfect escape, and nobody knew of their escape until the next morning, when guards were doing their rounds and noticed that these three men were not waking up. And when one of the guards tried to poke Frank Morris in the head with his club, Morris's head literally fell to the ground. And it was at that moment when the prison guards had discovered that they had three men on the loose. The following day, on June 12th, almost instantly, military and law enforcement agencies began investigations on the air, land, and sea surrounding the prison. And while some bits and pieces of items used by the escapees were found spread across the general area, there is no recorded evidence of what happened to the three men after they left the Alcatraz grounds. During the investigation that took place on the 12th, Alan West was caught with his papier-mâché replica head. And at this point, the guards knew what the head was going to be used for. And Alan was about to be in a lot of trouble. And because of that, Alan was willing to give up all of the information he had to ensure that he didn't get in too much trouble for having this papier-mâché head. And fortunately, he did, because Alan is the biggest reason why we have all of the information we have about this entire escape. Without Alan essentially ratting on his friends, a lot of this prison escape would have been left to speculation. Now, if you want to get into a bit of conspiracy, since their escape, there has been alleged sightings of these escaped men, some in the United States, some in Brazil, and a letter has even surfaced supposedly being written from one of these escapees to a loved one, claiming that all of the men made it out alive, although none of these were ever confirmed. And it's very likely that all of the men that escaped Alcatraz that day either died during their escape or are dead now due to natural causes, or simply due to the consequences of living a life of crime. So yeah, when you mix a prison that is impossible to escape with prisoners that are impossible to keep confined, you get an ongoing mystery that lasts over 60 years. But as crazy as this story may be, we still have two more to cover. The Catch Me If You Can escapes. When you were a kid on the playground playing tag with your friends, did you ever say, "Catch me if you can," while running away? Well, Frank Abagnale said "catch me if you can" every day to the FBI for years while on the run for stealing millions of dollars and breaking a laundry list of other laws. The story of Frank Abagnale literally inspired the movie Catch Me If You Can. And today, I'm gonna tell the real story of exactly how he escaped prison both times. I did give a bit of a teaser on why he was put in jail, but let me give a bit more context. Frank Abagnale started at an early age, similar to the first story, when he moved to New York at the age of 16 by himself. He quickly realized that as a child, you can't do much, so he decided to no longer be a child. He altered his driver's license to say 26, not 16. Not only does he need to be an adult, but he needs money, and living in New York is not cheap. So what's the natural next step? Get a job, right? Earn some money? Of course not. You start defrauding banks with fraudulent checks. And that's exactly exactly where Frank Abigail Jr. started his infamous streak of conning and crime. Frank wasn't your average run-of-the-mill fraudster, and he was rather clever and charming. And one of the biggest reasons why he was able to get away with his crimes for so long is because he was a serial imposter, specifically by impersonating professionals when cashing these checks so that there was less scrutiny and chance of being figured out. He faked being a pilot, a doctor, a lawyer, and other white-collar professions to ensure that he was not on anybody's radar. And obviously, it worked. After collecting millions of dollars from these fraudulent checks and living a luxurious lifestyle and traveling the world on money that wasn't his, Frank was ultimately caught. Frank was initially caught in France, where he spent time in both French prisons and Swedish prisons. And after serving time in both countries and being banned from Sweden, Frank was deported back to the United States of America. And when Frank's plane landed in New York City, while it was still on the tarmac, Frank was able to escape the plane through the kitchen galley. And not only did he escape the plane through the galley, but he also escaped from the airport on foot. Keep in mind, airports are pretty secure places. And I guess this was, a different time, if you know what I mean. But still, that's a pretty crazy feat. This is the tame prison escape of the two, which is why I'm kind of covering it a bit quickly. Frank ended up being on the run for a few weeks until he was caught once again, this time at the Montreal airport. You'd think this guy would have learned his lesson around airports, but I guess not. It's also a bit ironic that he was caught in Quebec, a French-speaking Canadian province. Regardless, it's this second capture which sparks the crazy story of his second escape from prison. Frank was sent to a federal detention center in Atlanta, Georgia, where he was awaiting his trial. And it was at this detention center where he pulled off the most lucky and almost funny prison escapes. The US Marshal that brought Frank Abigail into this detention center somehow managed to forget Abigail's paperwork. And this gave Abigail a lot of room to come up with convenient stories. And the story that he began to spin was that he was a prison inspector, a secret shopper of penitentiaries, if you will. And because of this, although he was incarcerated, he was given very special treatment, specifically by the guards. One of the most interesting perks that Frank got was he actually wasn't even in a prison jumpsuit. He was allowed to wear street clothes, which may seem simple, but is a huge privilege. So even though Frank is locked up, he's not necessarily in a bad situation. Guards are speculating that because there's no papers, he must be a prison inspector. Frank is definitely not gonna tell them that's not the case. He's being given special treatment in this jail, which is almost unheard of. And he then gets the idea that, maybe I can get out of this place. And that's exactly where his escape begins. After he decided that he was going to escape, he calls his girlfriend, as he knew that he would need somebody on the outside to help validate the story he was about to tell. When he called his girlfriend, he ensured that she had an FBI business card from an agent that previously visited her due to some other things that Frank was up to, and then he asked her to impersonate a magazine writer, which she did, and she used this fake writer persona to set up a meeting with the real police inspector, who she would also get the business card of, which was the entire point of the meeting. Once Frank's girlfriend had the FBI's card and the prison inspector's card, they were well on their way to breaking Frank out. She went to a local paper copy place and made 500 copies of the FBI agent's business card, but she changed the contact number on the business card to a payphone in a mall. During her next visit, she gave Frank both of these business cards, and with these business cards in hand, Frank was able to convince prison guards that he, in fact, was a prison inspector. Frank convinced one of these guards that he had an urgent meeting with the FBI and that he needed to be released immediately, and he even urged the guard to call the FBI agent's number on the business card that he had, which he did. And when this prison guard called the FBI agent, it was really Abigail who was waiting at the mall. And Abigail played that part perfectly, claiming that Frank had extremely sensitive information that he needed to give to her immediately, and that this information was too high level for this prison guard to be made aware of. And for that reason, the FBI agent was going to come pick up Frank at once, because his prison inspection had come to a close. And later that day, prison guards walked Frank directly out of the prison, allowing him to walk directly into his girlfriend's car, and Frank drove off into the sunset once again as a free man. Although this perfect escape didn't have a perfect ending. At least, not in the way that he thought, because he was caught only a month later in New York. Frank was sentenced to 12 years in prison, where he actually ended up only serving 5, as he made a deal with the FBI that he would be released early if he would help the FBI on fraud cases and teach them all of the tricks that he used to commit all of the crimes that he did. A good deal both ways around. Now, the story actually ended up having a bit of a happy ending, because Frank really did turn his life around. He was able to be a very valuable asset to the FBI. He actually met his wife while doing FBI work and had 3 sons, and one of his sons is actually actually now an FBI agent. And while the escape story was utter insanity, one of the most interesting facts about this entire case is the fact that after all of the crimes were committed, all of the time on the run, and all of the jail time was served, Frank was only 26 years old, which means that everything I just described happened when he was 16 to 26. This man literally lived a lifetime's worth of life in a decade. And it's no wonder that he had such a successful book and eventual movie adaptation. There's obviously a lot more to Frank's life story, but that's beyond the scope of this video. And speaking on beyond the scope of this video, let me just say this. When doing research for this video, I found so many insane stories about people escaping prison in literally insane ways. And for this video, I wanted to pick some pretty famous examples that were verifiably crazy and also somewhat well known. However, I do have a list of over 30 other examples of people who escaped prison around the world in the most insane ways. So if you guys loved this video and would like a part 2 about more obscure and more unknown prison escapes, please let me know in the comments that you would love a part 2 to this video, and I would be more than happy to make it. Maybe if this video hits 20,000 likes, I'll make a follow-up. Your guys' support truly means a lot. Now, let's get to our third crazy prison break story. The Japanese prison break. Yoshie Shiratori is likely one of the most famous escape artists from all of Japan, and he didn't have a career in magic. He unfortunately had a life of crime. Yoshie lost his father at the age of 2, and his own mother abandoned him shortly after. And as an adolescent, he worked at a tofu shop, and then later became a fisherman, catching crabs in Russia. However, after succumbing to a crippling gambling addiction, he turned to a life of crime. Throughout his crime career, Yoshie famously escaped from 4 different prisons, and I'm about to tell you about every single one of them. Yoshie was initially put behind bars in 1936 for a felony murder charge, a murder charge that is speculated to have been a false, forced confession from abusive prison guards. Regardless, Yoshie was in prison, and during this time in the early 1900s, Japanese prison was extremely harsh, and it was for that reason that people were almost left no other option than try to escape because the living conditions were simply so horrible. And Yoshie was no different. Not long after being locked up, Yoshie began studying the routines of the guards to have an understanding of their patterns so he could potentially plan an escape. And one day, while cleaning himself in the bathhouse, he found the perfect tool to escape. He took one of the metal bands off of a wash bucket in the bathhouse and brought it back to his cell, where he was able to fashion this thin, flimsy piece of metal into a makeshift lockpick. And he used this lockpick to escape. He first waited for the guards to pass by his cell, and then he put pieces of wood underneath a blanket on his bed to make it appear that he was in his cell. And then he began picking the lock directly on the front door of his cell. One of the most brazen escapes we've talked about so far in this video. After successfully picking the lock on his own cell, he was free from his cell, but still behind many other locked doors. And surprisingly, he was able to successfully lockpick through numerous other doors and successfully escape the prison and achieve freedom once again. But this is only his first escape of many, as 3 days after his initial escape, he was already back in police custody because he was found stealing supplies from a local hospital. Because of this escape and attempted theft, he was given another life sentence and transferred to a different prison. Originally, Yoshie was actually placed back in the original prison he escaped from, but during World War II in 1942, Yoshie was actually transferred to another prison, known as Akita Prison, where he found himself in harsher conditions. And the guards at this prison were very privy to his escape attempts, and they wanted to make sure that they made an example out of Yoshie. One of the additional punishments that Yoshie received at this new prison was extended solitary confinement. And these solitary confinement rooms were literally designed for escape artists. They had smooth copper walls, the ceiling was extremely high, and the only way in and out was the front door, besides a skylight that was at the very top of the very high ceiling, which obviously nobody could reach. Right? Well, almost anybody couldn't reach. Because on June 15th, in solitary confinement, Yoshie decided to escape once again. When I say Yoshie was a master escape artist, I mean it. And he was able to escape this unescapable room. And how he did it was he first got out of his handcuffs. Oh yeah, he was literally kept in handcuffs 24/7 in this new prison just because they wanted to make extra sure he would not escape. But obviously that didn't stop him. He escaped these handcuffs by finding a piece of wire once again in this solitary confinement. Where it came from, we don't know. But regardless, he used it to unpick his handcuffs. At this point, his hands were free, and he began to use his bare palms and feet to scale the sides of this extremely tall prison cell. cell. Not only was Yoshie a master lockpicker, but he was also a very talented climber, and this came in handy here. And after a few attempts, he was able to make it to this skylight, which was sealed by metal bars and impossible to escape through, besides the fact that it had a wooden frame securing those metal bars. And that wooden frame was rotting due to its exposure to the elements. Now, Yoshie wasn't able to just break this wood frame in one go, but similar to the first story where the men broke through the concrete over time, Yoshie over time was able to pick away at the wooden window frame until he was able to escape through the roof of this unescapable room. Once Yoshie was certain that the wooden frame was brittle enough, he waited until a particularly stormy night to bust through the roof, as he assumed on a stormy night the guards would be less likely to suspect tapping on the ceiling to be footsteps and more likely to simply write them off as rain, which is exactly what he did, and it worked flawlessly. And once again, Yoshie was a free man. Now this time you must be asking yourself, okay, obviously he didn't steal again, right? He escaped prison twice, almost an impossible feat. There's no way he was going to steal again to go back to prison, right? And you're technically right, but obviously he did go back to jail because we still have 2 more escapes to talk about. And the reason he was sent back to prison is rather unique. After his 3 months of essentially homeless freedom, he decided to pay one of the head guards from Akita prison a visit, because this head guard was one of the only ones who never beaten and abused him. The guard recognized Yoshie at his door and let him in and fed Yoshie and allowed him to tell his story. And Yoshie explained to the head guard that he was here simply to tell him his plan because he deserved to know, because he was the only one who treated Yoshie well. Yoshie explained how he wanted to go to America to raise awareness about the human rights violations that were taking place in Japanese prison, and hopefully through this awareness and a civil lawsuit be able to gain his freedom once again. And while this head guard seemed to be respectful and listening, when Yoshie went to use the washroom, this head guard unsurprisingly called the police and Yoshie was sent back to prison once again. Now this time, Yoshie requested that he at least go to a Tokyo prison where it's a bit warmer, because the first 2 prisons he had spent time in were in the northern part of Japan where it was relatively cold, which only added to the distress that he experienced within prison. However, this 3rd prison he was sent to was not in Tokyo and not in a warm climate at all. It was actually the northernmost prison in all of Japan, known as Abashiri Prison. And the guards at this prison were not messing around. At this point, they knew this man was extremely clever and not only escaped from 1 prison, but from 2, using different methods. And when they booked him into this 3rd prison, they made sure that he would never escape again. He was in a cell that only had openings that were smaller than the human body, so he could not possibly escape. He was given custom fit ankle cuffs and arm cuffs that were behind his back without keyholes, so they could not possibly be picked. And he was almost always by himself in freezing cold conditions. And on top of this, his life sentence was only extended due to his additional escape. So realistically, at this point, Yoshie had nothing to live for. His arms and legs were bound, there was absolutely no opportunity for escape, and he was alone all of the time, freezing cold and poorly treated. But somehow, Yoshie still had one more trick up his sleeve. While confined in this hellhole, Yoshi's body was basically useless, but his mind was definitely not. And what he did to escape Abashiri prison was absolutely insane. He realized that the cell that he was being held in was made primarily of iron, and the food that he was given every single day was a very salty miso soup. And while he needed to eat as much of his food as possible to live, he always left a little bit of miso soup behind, which he would splash directly on the bolts of the observation window on the door and on the hinges of his handcuffs and ankle cuffs. And slowly, over time, the salt and oxygen exposure on this metal would slowly cause it to rust and weaken. And after 6 months of slowly deteriorating the metal that confined him, he was able to make a move. Once again, at night, he started by fully removing his leg cuffs and then his arm cuffs, and then began the true challenge. He began unbolting the observation window on the front door of his cell, but there was still one problem. Even with the observation window bars removed, the hole was still too small for the human body. Well, at least the average human body. Yoshie was, of course, a talented contortionist. Maybe because he was ultra flexible, or maybe just because he was ultra determined, he was able to dislocate his shoulders to shove his torso through this observation window and flop himself on the ground outside of his cell, almost free. He later broke through an unprotected window in the ceiling in a different part of the jail and was once again a free man. And also the first person ever to escape from Abashiri prison, one of the most brutal Japanese prisons ever. But similar to Alcatraz, the risks associated with escaping this prison weren't just within the walls. Even if you escape this prison, you are still in an extremely remote northern part of Japan with no civilization around you, extremely cold temperatures, and on top of all of this, mountain bears. But somehow, Yoshie still survived. He ended up finding an abandoned mine shaft in one of the nearby mountains and was able to live in there alone, primarily eating nuts, berries, small animals in the area, and even crab fishing, which he reported to have learned from watching the bears do it, which is insane if true. But here's the thing, Yoshi didn't die in this mine shaft. He obviously got a bit restless and decided that it was worth risking going back into civilization and made the long trek to the nearest city, where he was surprised to see English and American soldiers and what seemed to be a huge change in the culture. And that's when he grabbed a newspaper and got caught up to date. During his 2 years spent in this abandoned mine shaft, World War II had come to a close, Japan had surrendered, and America, for the most part, had taken over the entire penitentiary system, which to Yoshi was a huge relief because he assumed at that point that there would be huge reform and at the very least, they'd be less on his case. And with this newfound information, he felt more confident to try to return to his family. But it was on this 50-day journey from where he was to his family that he found himself in trouble once again. Starving on his journey, he decided to pick some tomatoes from a tomato field that he was passing. And the farmer who owns this field just so happened to see Yoshi take these tomatoes. And this farmer mistook Yoshi for a local thief. The two ended up fighting, and the farmer ended up dying as a result of the fight. Some claims state that Yoshi killed this man accidentally, and others claim that it was legitimate self-defense. Regardless, the farmer was killed, and Yoshi, once again, was caught. But initially, they didn't even know who they had. They only thought they had a murderer, but once he was fully booked, they realized that they had the infamous escapist Yoshi Shiatori. And he was no longer sentenced to life in prison, he was sentenced to death. The year is now 1947, and Yoshi is being sent to Sapporo prison, where he will await his execution. And obviously, because Yoshi has now escaped 3 different prisons using 3 different methods and now has theft and murder under his belt, the police are taking absolutely no chances with this final cell. Yoshi is being given 24/7 surveillance, reinforced doors and bars, and any opening that leads to this room is smaller than the human head. Because no matter how good of a contortionist you are, you can't make your skull smaller. So in this situation, there is absolutely no way that Yoshi escapes, right? This is obviously where the story ends. He was obviously later executed by the Japanese government, and that's history, right? Of course not. This is Yoshi we're talking about. And interestingly, this is one of the most simple escapes he performed. Because since day 1 in this jail cell, Yoshi started playing mind games, specifically by always looking up. Yoshi, up until this point, had always escaped through the roof, and his guards knew that. And every day when the guards would check on him, Yoshi would make sure that he was looking up. And as a result, the guards were always looking up, making sure that when they would check on Yoshi, they would always check the ceiling. But this escape had nothing to do with the ceiling, and Yoshi was going in the opposite direction. Yoshi's cell was fortified on the walls, ceiling, openings, but one place that wasn't fortified was the floor. And over the course of a month, Yoshi would remove a floorboard and begin digging into the floor below his bed, in secrecy until he had a usable tunnel. And once again, one morning, the guards were unable to get a response out of Yoshi. And when they entered his cell, they realized that what was in his bed wasn't Yoshi, but once again, a pile of wood. Almost a calling card at this point. And for a year, Yoshi was on the run. And as you may or may not know, he did go back to jail one last time. But this time was different. He ended up confessing to a random police officer who decided to offer him a cigarette in public. And at this point, Yoshi could not handle the guilt, and he confessed everything to this police officer who was simply offering a gesture of kindness. But when Yoshi was tried again, things were different. The system treated him with sympathy. Reform seemed to have taken place. The murder charge he had was dropped and considered self-defense. And as a result, so was his execution. His request to go to a Tokyo prison was accepted, and his new sentence was only 20 years. 20 years which he happily served, as his prison conditions were much better. And after 14 out of those 20 years, Yoshi was paroled on good behavior, and was for the first time in a long time, a truly free man. This story is insane, and I knew I had to save it for last. And while some claim parts are exaggerated, personally, I don't even care. I think it's a great story. And for that reason, Yoshi is a bit of a legend in Japan, and there are even statues up of him, which is kind of interesting. But I suppose the story is something you can learn from. Yoshi passed away in 1979 at the age of 71, but he still lives on today in folklore, stories like this, films, books, and other stuff like that. I want to thank you guys so much for watching this video. This video was so fun to make, and honestly, these were 3 insane stories. The scariest cults from around the world. Imagine you're standing on the street just minding your own business when you get approached by a couple and they have some important information for you. They tell you that they are spiritual guides and they can help take you to a next level of existence beyond Earth and human comprehension. They say that you can transcend humanity by transforming into an immortal extraterrestrial being. It sounds like an interesting proposal. So you take a flyer and attend a meeting, and at this point you can go either one of two ways. Your suspicions are either confirmed and you realize that you spoke to crazy people, or you believed you talked to some of the most important people ever, and in that instance, you just joined a cult. This cult is known as Heaven's Gate, and it was an American cult founded in 1974 by Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles, who, like I mentioned, saw themselves as spiritual guides to a next level of human existence. Without spoiling the ending, Heaven's Gate is most commonly known for its mass suicides committed by its members, but the story goes a lot deeper than just the headlines. Nettles and Applewhite first met in 1972 and went on a journey of spiritual discovery together, and came out on the other side identifying themselves as two witnesses of Revelation, or the Book of Apocalypse in the Bible. This claim alone, and some clever convincing, was reason enough for them to start attracting hundreds of people to start at least paying attention to their movement in the mid-70s. And after a few years, they even had over a dozen members adopting a monastic lifestyle, dedicating their life to Heaven's Gate, and giving up all worldly pursuits beyond this cult, which is insane. This cult is commonly recognized as a UFO religion, primarily because the central belief of this group was that the followers could transform themselves into immortal extraterrestrial beings by rejecting their human nature. By rejecting this human nature, they would, by default, ascend to heaven, or what they would refer to as the next level. This cult primarily grew by Applewhite and Nettles trying to contact other extraterrestrials, aka like-minded people, aka other crazy people. They took out ads and flyers to promote meetings where they would recruit disciples that they called the crew. At these events, they would purport to represent beings from another planet who were looking for patients for an experiment. That alone is already creepy. They got straight to the crazy even on sign up. There was no easing into it, it seemed. They mentioned, though, that those who agreed to take part in their experiment would be brought to a higher evolutionary level. An interesting proposal, potentially, but still, red flags are everywhere. In 1975, Applewhite and Nettles preached at a motel hall in Oregon, and following that session, over 20 people sold all of their worldly possessions and essentially disappeared off the face of the planet, not being seen by family, friends, or even the general public at all. These people didn't just disappear, but they had become a part of Heaven's Gate, which at this point had already began going underground. Applewhite and Nettles changed their name to Doe and T, and they had led nearly 100 people across the country to ditch their families and join Heaven's Gate. The lore that they came up with is deep, and it's a really weird twist on a lot of existing religious texts and theories about history. But one of the more interesting claims they made is that they believe that Jesus himself was an alien, which is an interesting take for sure. But what's more interesting is what happened in October of 1996. The group rented a large house that they called the Monastery, which was a 10,000 square foot mansion in California. At the time, they were paying $7,000 per month in rent cash, and they even took out alien abduction insurance on each of their members, with a $1 million payout per person. Which, who the hell is selling alien abduction insurance? But that's a side point. That's a video about insurance scams, not cults. Now, this house isn't the interesting event, but it's the precursor to what really put this cult on the map. Nearly 1 year into renting the monastery, Applewhite taped a video of himself entitled Doe's Final Exit, where he spoke on mass death and how it was the only way to evacuate this earth. He was convinced that the comet Hale-Bopp was the sign that the group had been looking for, and speculated that there was a UFO following this comet. And because of this, Applewhite and 38 of his followers prepared a ritual death. This death lined up exactly with when the comet was closest to the earth, so that their souls could reach the next level. In the following days, 39 people had taken a concoction of vodka and poison, and, like you may have guessed, died. There is so much crazy and honestly disturbing lore to this cult, but I think the best way to describe it is that they believe that humans were boring, aliens were cool, and if a human wanted to become an alien, they had to die. It's amazing what people are willing to believe and dedicate and sacrifice their life for. Oh, and if the Heaven's Gate logo looks familiar, Lil Uzi Vert used it as inspiration for his album cover, which is odd. assuming you're a semi-reasonable person, you're likely not interested or swayed by the claims of an afterlife and UFOs and being a part of the Bible from random strangers. What a reasonable person may be interested in, though, is a community that worships God, people that are like-minded in faith, a faith that at surface level seems semi-reasonable. In this instance, you may be interested in the Children of God. This name already may sound familiar, and that's because Nick Crowley, a great YouTuber, just made a video about some of the lore involved with this cult. Specifically, the TV programs this cult was producing, which was insane. It was essentially propaganda pieces for children. And spoiler alert, it was pretty disturbing. But we'll get to that. The Children of God lore is deep, and I'll do my best to summarize it as neatly as possible. The Children of God was founded by a creep named David Berg in 1968. It initially attracted young followers with the message of love, communal living, and devotion, which may sound innocent enough. But the group soon became infamous for its controversial beliefs and practices. Most of these controversial beliefs and practices started to be introduced once the cult was more established. Initially, some of their beliefs were more conservative and aligned with the Bible, although it seemed that the group's beliefs started to morph to fit Berg's personal desires, which we'll get into. For example, initially the group was rather conservative and didn't even believe in hand-holding until marriage. But once Berg had an affair with his assistant, he then started spreading messages of polygamy, which turned into what he called sharing, which we'll get into, and that gets a lot darker. Before we get too into the weeds, let's give some context. This group was founded with a core focus on an apocalyptic prophecy, where Berg was claiming that the world was set to end in 1993. And the purpose of this group was to promote love and devotion to God so that they could be saved during this apocalypse. They spread their messages through song and dedicated as much time as possible to praising God before the end times. Child members of this group were not even educated because they saw it as a waste of time because the world was ending soon anyway. So all of the children and adults in this group were simply sitting, hanging out, singing songs, waiting for the end of the world, which to me doesn't sound like a great time. But that's just me. Floor Edwards, a previous member of the Children of God, said this about the cult's mindset at the time. Quote, "For many, it was euphoric thinking about the afterlife. We earned that spot in heaven. We were the chosen ones." That's definitely a take on it. Interestingly, Berg wasn't seen very often by most of the cult members, as at its peak, the group had over 10,000 members worldwide. Although he was in consistent communication with all of his followers through what he called Mo letters, which was essentially daily propaganda pieces, where he would take Bible verses and intertwine them with his own twisted doctrine, which, like I mentioned earlier, evolved over time. These Mo letters included instructions that his followers must follow, and strangely enough, a lot of the imagery in these letters was rather graphic. We'll say that. According to ex-members of the Children of God, Mo wrote over 3,000 of these Mo letters, which is insane. But these letters weren't the only way that the Children of God was able to get their message out. Like I mentioned, Nick Crowley made a great video about the TV series that the Children of God had created and that was televised called Life with Grandpa, in which he describes the TV show essentially indoctrinating children into the values of the group and the religious beliefs that were unsavory, to say the least. To really paint the picture, there's a scene in the show where a woman is shown as a robot with literal boobs, and Grandpa, aka David Berg, was talking about how much he loves this perfect woman. And there's many episodes with young girls singing about how their purpose is to cook, clean, and take care of the men in their life. That is honestly just a tame sampling of some of the cool stuff in this cult's kid show. Of course, I'm using cool ironically. Now, going back to the concept of sharing. Without getting too graphic, essentially, Berg was promoting love with no bounds, as he claimed that Jesus created love and sex for people to enjoy, and he thought the best way to honor God was to have it without limits, which to him meant with anybody at any time, consenting or not, which also included with children, which is obviously disgusting. Former members who were children at the time said that they felt pressured to do anything with anyone because they knew if they said no that they would be punished by God and potentially not accepted into heaven when the apocalypse came, which was, in their mind, soon. This, unsurprisingly, led to widespread allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse, of course, including minors. The Children of God faced significant backlash and legal scrutiny due to the reports of emotional, psychological, and sexual abuse among members, although that wasn't quite enough to take it down fully. That was the bump in the road for the group. After David Berg died, his assistant, who he was having the affairs with, took over the group and tried rebranding the group multiple times in an attempt to distance it from its dark past. And they even tried to renounce some of their harmful practices. However, the decades of trauma experienced by former members was an inseparable part of the cult's history. And with the death of David, the rebrands, and all of the allegations, the group went from over 10,000 members worldwide to today being a small underground internet community. And I personally hope it continues to shrink to the point of nothingness very soon. I'm sure the world not ending in 1993 also had a big part to do with it. Interestingly, multiple celebrities were actually involved with this cult, notably Joaquin Phoenix and Rose McGowan. Rose McGowan described her experience as extremely stressful, like she was walking a high-wire act. She was expected to be perfect physically and was even cut with a knife by another member when she had a blemish on her finger. How Rose was involved in this group was because her father was actually the leader of the Italian branch of the Children of God. But fortunately, once the Children of God started promoting child abuse, her dad separated from the group entirely. Joaquin Phoenix and his siblings in the 1970s were also involved in the group, and even traveled through Central and South America with the group, but didn't remain members for long, as initially they thought it was a dedicated religious group, but found out that it was much deeper than that and cut ties. It's upsetting enough when individuals are tricked into joining cults and doing unspeakable things and having horrible lives, but it's just downright disheartening and depressing when they get their children involved too. Likely unsurprisingly, the Children of God had a extremely high rate, with many ex-members having lifelong trauma, psychological illnesses, and at the very least, horrible, unforgettable memories. But if you're not interested in aliens, and you're not interested in any sort of religious movement, what if a man approached you and told you that he could tell you when you're going to die? This to anybody may seem like an interesting proposal, but the more info you start to get, the more the cracks start to show. This man referred to himself as Lou Castor and claimed that he was 1,000 years old and he was the combination of 3 different angels. He claimed that he had died and came back to life and that now he himself can predict deaths accurately, among other things. Potentially one of the biggest draws for some is that Lou claimed that if you were close to him, he could not only predict your death, but bring you back to life, which for most people sounds like a good reason to stick around. But on top of the claims of being resurrected, from a surface level, it looked like the members of this group lived a relatively lavish lifestyle. Lou had a compound in Wichita, Kansas, where he had 10 members of the group living with him. Everybody who was completely provided for with food, shelter, technology, toys, gadgets, ATVs, luxury vehicles, anything these members could want, they had, and it was all provided for by Lou. But interestingly enough, nobody knew what Lou did for work. He said he had stocks and bonds and a cattle ranch down in Texas, but nobody could directly pinpoint his wealth, and it didn't seem like anybody was extremely concerned because they were directly benefiting from it, although it definitely came with a price. Having a 10-person commune with luxury vehicles in Wichita, Kansas definitely drew attention, but for this cult, that wasn't an issue. And Lou was an active participant in the community. He would donate to the police, have community-wide barbecues in his backyard, and even had an ATV track on his 10-acre property where anybody could come and enjoy the track. This sense of community definitely allowed people to feel a little bit more comfortable, and I think people assumed that if he had something to hide, he wouldn't be so flashy, which may seem reasonable, but you could also say this is more or less of a John Wayne Gacy approach. But here's the thing. Behind closed doors, unspeakable things were happening, and although on the surface it seemed like an outgoing, luxury lifestyle of cool people just having fun, it was really anything but that once you got to the core of the group. When Angel's Landing went from Texas to Wichita, Kansas, they actually gained 3 new members: Lou's real estate agent and 2 young daughters. This real estate agent sold Lou the property, and upon meeting him, she felt very compelled to not only be close to him, but protect him. And he shortly after confessed to her that he was an angel. Because of this information, this real estate agent uprooted herself and her 2 young daughters from Missouri to Wichita, Kansas to join the commune, leaving her husband and her children's father behind. I'm assuming you can guess where this is going, and it ended up with Lou assaulting and abusing both of these young girls. But not only that, combining it with mental manipulation to make them feel like it was almost normal, which it obviously wasn't at all. In 2003, the story got a lot more publicized, as one of the members living in the commune had passed away. This member had seemingly fallen, hit their head, and then fell into the pool, which caused them to drown and die, which obviously got a lot of attention but wasn't necessarily considered suspicious, at least not legally. The death aligned with most accidental drowning deaths and was not considered for having any foul play, although that didn't mean that there wasn't any questions stirring about this commune within the community. At this time, unbeknownst to Lou and the rest of the commune, the police were actually closely monitoring the commune, but not for the reasons you may have thought. they were being monitored by the narcotics department because Lou had unexplained wealth, and their assumption was that there was an illegal drug operation or something along those lines funding this 10-acre ranch with seemingly unlimited money. And with the news breaking of this death on the property, some members in the community had their own questions as well. This member that they lost was considered to be the mother of the group, and she was Lou's right-hand woman. And it was a tragic loss within the group and outside of the group, as she was somebody that people looked up to and at least had a positive relationship with publicly. Following the death of the member who passed away in the pool, the other members of the group were waiting for Lou to bring her back, as he claimed that this was an ability of his. And after some time passed, Lou changed his story and claimed that he doesn't want to bring Patricia back. Lou claimed that where Patricia is now is much better than where we are, and that our goal is to meet her where she's at and not to bring her back here. And I suppose that was a satisfactory response to some of the members. And although the death was ruled as accidental, the FBI was interested, to say the least. They began looking into a Lou Castro and realized that there is no record of this person existing. No documents, no birth certificate, no driver's license. They were dealing with a ghost, until they found one piece of information referencing the name. This was an obituary for a woman he used to live with in a previous smaller commune. This woman had passed away with her new boyfriend and daughter during a leisure flight, and unfortunately, shortly after takeoff, this entire group passed away. It's an interesting side note, but Lou was previously a plane mechanic. That, again, was ruled as an accidental death. But the coincidences are starting to kind of fall apart here. 3 years after the death of the woman in the pool, her husband, another member of Angel's Landing, was killed as well. He was working on his car and laying underneath a vehicle when his jack failed, crushing and killing him. The unfortunate and tragic death of this second member of Angel's Landing was a pivotal moment in discovering the truth. Like I mentioned, the Angel's Landing group was already under investigation secretly by the FBI and local authorities. But once 2 accidental deaths took place within 3 years, they cranked up their search and began looking at alternative means of information. And one thing they found that cracked this case wide open was the insurance payouts on these group members. Both Patricia, the woman who died in the pool, and her husband, who died under the car years later, had large life insurance policies, both of which specifically paying out to the Angel's Landing group, which was 100% controlled by Lou Castro. Each of these policies paid out over $1.2 million. And suddenly, things are starting to make a lot of sense. Somebody who's able to predict deaths and then have them magically happen, somebody who has accidental deaths magically follow him around, and somebody who has an unexplainable amount of wealth, but no source of income. All now starts to make a lot more sense when you realize that there may be some foul play going on here. But in case that's not enough to make you convinced that there was something really strange going on to this cult, 2 years after the husband of the initial woman who died passed away, there was a third death within the group. It was the death of the real estate agent who moved into the commune to protect him. This same woman that had 2 young daughters in the group. Lou got her 2 young daughters together and told them that it was her mother's time and that she was going to die shortly. Obviously, they were extremely upset and didn't want to believe it, and they told their mom. And their mom didn't seem too fazed and reassured them that she wasn't going anywhere and that she was going to be fine. But unfortunately, 2 days later, she passed away in a horrible car accident. And at that point, detectives were no longer allowing this to go on anymore. Once again, a life insurance payout was due to hit Lou's account any day. And coincidentally, the previous balance was getting pretty low from the last payout. It's almost like this was how he was funding his lifestyle. At this point, detectives were just going to his property and had a unique plan to collect fingerprints to try to get more information. They knocked on Lou's door and they told him that they were looking for information on local criminals and had pictures of criminals that they wanted him to potentially identify. The detectives entered his home and were starting to show him pictures, hoping to get fingerprints on the photographs, but they noticed that Lou was only grabbing these photos with his fingernails, meaning that he knew what was going on and that they were not going to get any fingerprints. Eventually, they were able to get him on charges of bank fraud, but realized that they needed to get him on these murders if they wanted him to serve any substantial time. And at this point, the stars almost aligned, because the eldest of the 2 young girls who were a part of this group at this point was an adult, and had met a man who shortly became her boyfriend. Not long into dating, they had a moment and she opened up to him about everything. And that night when she went to bed, he went to the FBI website and informed them about everything that was going on in this strange cult in Wichita. Surprisingly, they were quick to respond, collected her statement, and began a full-blown investigation on all of these claims. At this point, they were able to speak to the younger daughter as well, where they were able to collect all the information they needed to put this man away for a serious amount of time. During this Lou person's trial, it was revealed that his name isn't Lou at all, and that was only one of his many aliases, and that his name is Daniel Perez, and he has an extensive history of sexual abuse and much more. And the result of this trial happened in 2015, when Daniel Perez, aka Lou Castro, was sentenced with 80 years in prison. Unfortunately, all of the deaths involving Angel's Landing were still ruled accidental, but they did have a strong enough case through all of the other crimes to put him away for the rest of his life. Okay, I know this is a cult video and not a true crime video, but for Angel's Landing specifically, the beliefs were rather simple. And it wasn't even super religious, honestly. This mysterious, wealthy man just claimed that he was an angel and could predict deaths and save people near him if they did die. And he also required intimacy with children to maintain his powers. Although in reality, he was just a pedophile who was killing his own cult members for insurance payouts to fund his lifestyle. So the religious beliefs are simple, but the lore of the actual story is insane. And I thought you guys would appreciate this twisted story. I know we focused on a lot of mind-bending, twisted, pseudo-religious, disgusting beliefs, so I wanted to kind of focus on the reality of the life in these cults in this story. But the more research I did, the more invested I got in this story. And well, here we go. Before we get into the last cult of this video, I just want to say that it is the unfortunate reality that there is so many crazy and scary cults that have existed and still exist to this day. And although I hand-selected a few for this first video, I do have a sizable number of other cults I do want to discuss, although I didn't want to make this video extremely long in case it wasn't something you guys were interested in, because I haven't really discussed cults on the channel before. So if you guys are interested about more scary and truly disturbing cults, let me know in the comments or leave this video a like. This sort of engagement helps me understand what videos you guys actually want to see. But with that, let's get into our final cult, of this video at least. Let's say that you have absolutely no interest in any sort of religious group at all. Let's just say that you're interested in history, and let's say that maybe you found a particular interest with the Knights Templar, the Catholic military group tasked with protecting the Holy Grail. Perhaps that's an area of interest for you. Well, what if you were approached by some individuals who claimed to be the descendants of that military group and claimed to hold their ideals and then some? You may be interested in hearing them out. And what if these people claimed to you that not only were they the descendants of the Knights Templar, but one of the members was also the reincarnation of Moses from the Bible and King Tut's dad? At that point, you're likely gone, but let's say you're still a little interested. But here's the catch. Even if you're potentially interested in hearing them out, you have to be approved. Specifically through a sizable donation, as this cult is a pretty elitist group, with a group size at its peak of only around 300 to 400 members. So unless you were really wealthy, you weren't even able to hear them out, because they believed that only the richest were even worthy of hearing their message. This was the message of the Order of the Solar Temple, a Neo-Templar movement and a cult. This group had members in Canada, Switzerland, and France. One of the founders of this cult actually had a child with another cult member and believed that this child was a perfect child and that it was a higher being, and that any children that were to happen within the cult would be higher beings as well too, to help his daughter on her purpose. The cult grew and grew, and over time there was a lot of mismanagement happening between the two founders who didn't speak much about the direction of the cult. One leader was focusing on the inner workings of the cult, specifically the meditations, ceremonies, and day-to-day management, and the other leader was focused on the recruitment process, essentially running seminars and spreading the message of their special little group. Because this cult required very significant financial backing, members started to become uneasy on where their money was going, as the cult seemed to have not been growing as much as it once was. And this perfect higher level baby was now a teenager, and she was starting to rebel against her own father as well. And in 1991, one of the ex-members actually sued the group, which definitely started to show the writing on the wall for this elitist cult. And the next year, in 1992, one of the cult leaders was actually arrested for trying to buy illegal firearms in Canada, which is some unfortunate foreshadowing for what's about to happen. Later that year, people were becoming more and more restless, as not only were they unsure about where their money was going, but at this point there were so many unfulfilled spiritual promises that people were starting to not believe any of the claims of these cult leaders. This is where things get dark. As the cult was beginning to crumble and they were losing members and backing, they felt that they needed to figure out something quick, and they decided that they needed to have a transition within their movement. This was a transition to another world. At this point, they began to prepare themselves and certain high-ranking people within the Solar Temple that they believed would be highly favored in this new world, aka people that they probably thought they could manipulate. While they were prepping their members about how to transition into this new world, they were also planning how they would get revenge for those who they felt betrayed them, aka people who saw through through the lies and left. The spree of this cult's revenge, starting with highly ranking cult members showing up at the door of previous cult members and stabbing their 5-month-old baby in the heart, as the leader of the Solar Temple claimed that this baby was the Antichrist, when in reality, the parents of this baby, who were also murdered in this horrific event, were simply people who didn't listen to the Solar Temple's demands, which were that they didn't get married and didn't have this baby because it wasn't what the higher beings wanted. It was essentially a power struggle that these former members were no longer interested in playing into. After this horrific murder, there was other instances of strange murder suicides until one of the most insane events associated with this cult happened. On the 5th of October in 1994, 23 people were found dead in a burning chalet in Switzerland. Their bodies were arranged in a circle, and they were all wearing ceremonial robes. After this mass death event, which was more murder than suicide, as most of the participants in this group didn't realize that they were going to be killed and left in a building that would be set on fire. Regardless, in total, 74 people died over the course of the multiple murders and mass murder suicides that happened because of the order of the Solar Temple. And it's not even known how many of these deaths were suicides and how many of these deaths were murders. Because the founders of this cult were killed in these rituals and any of the remaining members went into hiding, the authorities were stumped at what to do because there was nobody to charge and not much that they could do, as most of the participants were gone as well. The result was an extremely strengthened anti-cult movement in Europe, specifically in Francophone Europe. As this event was extremely publicized, the word was finally out about the danger that can be caused by cults. I suppose the one true silver lining about cults is the fact that they always seem to be self-imploding, although even a few moments of existence for the cults that I mentioned today are longer than they should have ever existed. None of these people needed to be hurt, psychologically damaged, abused, assaulted, or killed. And if anything, I hope this video shines a small light on the terrifying world of cults, manipulation, and abuse that's possible. The worst times to be born in human history. You might think you have things pretty hard right now, but if you have a roof over your head, access to clean water and electricity, and people around you that care about you, you've got a lot to be grateful for. A lot of the modern luxuries that we take for granted today didn't even exist 100 years ago, which just makes you think, if almost everything I enjoy right now didn't exist 100 years ago, what did life look like 1,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago? Well, in this video, we are going to dive into all the worst time periods to ever be born into. Everybody knows that the Roman Empire fell, but not many people talk about the time between the Roman Empire falling and the beginning of the Middle Ages. This period of time is referred to as the Late Antiquity, and it is a major time of political instability and a huge power shift in global politics at the time. Late Antiquity typically refers to anywhere from 200 AD to 700 AD, but for this section specifically, I'm going to be focusing on like 450 AD to 700 AD, because following the official end of the Roman Empire in 476 AD, a lot of things continued to happen and change until the end of the Late Antiquity in the beginning of the Middle Ages. Whenever there is a large change in almost any aspect of life, there is growing pains associated with it, because change is scary and difficult. And in the context of the Late Antiquity, anybody living in the Roman Empire was experiencing a huge cultural, political, and spiritual shift that had not been seen realistically for hundreds of years. This topic is undoubtedly extremely complex and nuanced, but I'm going to do my best to provide as much context as possible to describe why this time period would have sucked to be born and live in. And one of the biggest reasons for a lot of the hardships that people faced during this time was the widespread political instability, specifically because the empire that had controlled and mismanaged the entire geographical area for the last hundreds of years was no longer, meaning that by default, there was a power vacuum that people were hungry to fill. And of course, with the fall of one of the most iconic empires of all time, you also lose a lot of long-standing institutions, specifically armies, defense, banking, really anything that provided safety and stability to the people of Rome. Even before the fall of the Roman Empire, Rome was consistently under attack from different groups. But during the Late Antiquity, there was much less resources and manpower to fight off barbarian tribes like the Goths, the Vandals, the Huns, which meant that these barbarian tribes were extremely motivated because they knew that the big bad Roman Empire was not what it used to be. And what this resulted in was frequent wars, raids, and destruction across all of Europe and the Mediterranean, which for soldiers was devastating because at this point, soldiers were not as well equipped as they used to be, meaning that they were typically at a disadvantage during these attacks. And for civilians, that meant that they were simply less protected, making them vulnerable to barbarian raids, which is something you definitely do not want to be vulnerable to. On top of defenses being diminished and wars and raids being more frequent, there was also a huge economic decline, which was almost perfectly coupled with the political instability. And because of this, massive trade networks it shrank. Major culturally significant cities were destroyed and abandoned, and even agriculture was affected due to these consistent invasions. We think about ancient Roman and ancient Greek ruins today as this thing that existed only far in the past, but during the late antiquity, major Roman and Greek cities and institutions and buildings that were active and respected only 100 or a few hundred years ago were now in ruins, with the majority of these culturally significant locations either being destroyed in raids, left to rot because there's nobody to use them or maintain them because of the city's depopulation, or if these buildings were still in decent shape in a city that was somewhat populated or repopulating, a lot of these buildings were actually deconstructed from the inside out to be used for new buildings. For example, ceramic and bricks were taken from old antiquity buildings and used to build new churches. The late antiquity is an interesting period of history because it is regarded as one of the most transitional periods, as it was at the dawn of the rise of Christianity. And because of that, there was a lot of conflict surrounding other religions in the area. But for that reason, a lot of people see this time period as an opportunity and as something to be celebrated. And while that is definitely something to consider, the late antiquity is one of the most significant examples of transitioning from the old world to the new world. And living through that was not easy whatsoever. But in case you're still not convinced that the late antiquity is one of the worst times to be born in and alive in, allow me to present one thing I haven't mentioned yet, the Justinianic Plague, which took place during the peak of the late antiquity, specifically from 550 AD to 750 AD. And this 200-year period saw a drastic decline due to this plague that took place all across the Mediterranean and was responsible for the death of tens of millions of people. This plague was happening while all of this political uncertainty was happening, all of these wars and raids were happening, all of the economic decline was happening, and all of the religious chaos was happening. All of this at the same time as a deadly plague. So yeah, the late antiquity is not just a casual handoff of power or an example of growing pains, and had a lot of horrible things happening at the same time. And for that reason, I thought it was a great candidate for this list. But we have a lot more to discuss, so let's keep going. Following the late antiquity, I want to discuss a period of time that's a bit more modern. What I'm about to discuss isn't necessarily a time period, it's just a stretch of history that you would not want to be born in or live through at all. And this includes anywhere from 1914 to 1945. The first thing you're probably thinking about during this time period is the World Wars. And you're exactly right. World War I took place from 1914 to 1918. And during this time, if you were a healthy adult man, there was an extremely good chance that you were going to be sent into some of the worst hellish conditions ever imaginable. But we're just getting started. Obviously, World War I didn't only affect soldiers, as there was millions of civilian casualties as well. And it's estimated that in total, just from World War I alone, 15 to 22 million people died, with 9 to 11 million of those being military personnel and 6 to 13 million being possible civilian deaths. And that doesn't even account the injured and the displaced. But we're still only getting started. The conditions of World War I were insane. Trench warfare, machine guns, poison gas. These people did not have a quick and painless death. The people that did die died in some of the worst conditions this world has seen. But to add insult to injury, during 1918, not only was there a massive world war going on, but there was also a huge Spanish flu pandemic. And this pandemic was one of the deadliest pandemics in recorded history. And terrifyingly, sometimes killed young, healthy people in as little as 2 days. It's estimated that the Spanish flu killed at least 50 million people worldwide. Keep in mind, this is after 22 million from the First World War that just happened. Both of these major global events were extremely and almost unspeakably devastating. But we're still not done, because following World War I and following the Spanish flu pandemic, we find ourselves at the end of the 1920s, specifically 1929, when we began a time known as the Great Depression. During the Roaring 20s, most Western countries experienced massive economic prosperity and also had a huge social and cultural change post-war. But this cultural change was for the better, with a vibrant and optimistic outlook on life and the future, and everybody was making money and feeling better, and everything that was horrible and bad was behind us, right? We survived one of the biggest pandemics of all time and one of the worst wars of modern history. Of course we have something to celebrate. The bad times are behind us and everything is better, right? No. And the worst was only yet to come. 1929 was the catalyst of the Great Depression, and the Great Depression lasted through much of the 1930s. The Great Depression can be summarized by its economic, social, and psychological effects that it had on basically all of America. But it wasn't just America that was affected. This was a global economic catastrophe, and millions of lives were changed forever. At its peak in the United States, unemployment rates were as high as 25%. Businesses were closing left, right, and center, banks were failing, and because people lost their jobs, their savings, their livelihoods, and everything that they knew to be normal, people needed to adjust quickly or die. Poverty, hunger, homelessness were all extremely common during the Great Depression, as well as breadlines and soup kitchens, which were basically the government giving you rations of food, which typically weren't enough, but they helped. And it's not hard to believe that with this huge economic collapse came personal and political unease and restlessness. Any social programs that existed were now gone, which meant that the most vulnerable groups in society were now even more vulnerable. Old people, children, disabled people, anybody who wasn't fully and extremely self-reliant was now at risk. But even if you were self-reliant, there was still a huge psychological impact of this entire situation. Just imagine if 5 years ago you're experiencing the most prosperity you had in your life. You survived the plague, you survived the war, you had a business that was successful. It seemed like everything was okay. But then in October of 1929, everything changed. The bank where you stored your millions of dollars was closed. Your money was nowhere to be found. The business that you were operating was now empty because nobody was shopping, and you had to fire all of your employees. The close network of friends that you had around you was now dissipating because people were ditching town to find any sort of opportunity elsewhere. And you are left in a house that you're going to default on with people that you need to take care of, and the only option you really have is to get in the breadline and hope for the best. If nothing else, that's going to do something on your mental health. And we've even seen the effects of people who experienced and survived the Great Depression in future generations. During the Great Depression, people globally were uneasy. Everything that they felt they had worked for was taken from them. It was gone. And now most people are jobless, homeless, or at least hungry. And basically everybody was doing way worse than they were before. And this social unrest led to political unrest, which led to the rise of some pretty crazy ideologies, which brings us to the last thing I want to mention in this period of time during the early 1900s, the Second World War. As I stated earlier, the First World War is one of the most catastrophic things to happen in recent history. And the Second World War, unfortunately, was just as bad as World War I, if not much worse. The Second World War lasted longer, experienced much more death, experienced genocide, and so many more horrible things that weren't even possible during the First World War. Just for context, it's estimated that anywhere from 70 to 85 million people died during World War II. And it's believed that almost half of these deaths were civilian deaths, which is extremely upsetting. The Soviet Union alone lost 24 million people in World War II, which is more than all of the people lost in World War I, just for context. And once again, if you were a young, healthy man during this time, there was an extremely good chance that you were about to be exposed to hellish conditions and almost certain death. And if you were just living in Europe or Japan, there was also a good chance that no matter who you were, old, young, man, woman, you could very much so experience horrors beyond your comprehension. And the bookend on this entire period of time is the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima that ended the Second World War and killed around 200,000 people. I just described a handful of some of the most significant historical events in modern history, and all of these things happened in like a 40-year stretch. If you were born in 1898, you could have been old enough to fight at the end of World War I, experience the Spanish flu pandemic, lose all of your money in the Great Depression, and then as an adult fight in World War II as well. And by the time World War II ended, you would be 47 and have a lot of stories to tell. It's honestly just mind-boggling to think about, and for that reason, I knew it was one of the worst time periods to be born into and live in. I wanted to take a quick break from war because we've discussed a lot of it up to this point, so I wanted to talk about the year 536 AD, which is a year that, ironically, has been nominated as the worst year to be alive by Michael McCormick, who is a medieval scholar. And by medieval scholar, I don't mean he was a scholar in medieval times. I mean like he is a modern-day scholar of medieval times. Regardless, what happened in 536 AD? Well, if you paid attention to the first section, a lot, because 536 AD actually does take place during the late antiquity. But I didn't want to discuss it in that section because I wanted to make sure I had a separate spot for, well, a volcanic winter. During 536 AD, a massive volcanic eruption took place and literally cooled the Earth's climate, specifically Europe's and China's climate. And for 18 months, across China and Europe, there was a dark sky consistently, temperatures dropping as low as 2.5 degrees Celsius. And because of that unusual decrease in temperature during these 18 months, people not only experienced severe weather anomalies, but also widespread famine. But on top of both of these things, I can only imagine how scared and concerned people were, because this volcanic eruption happened in Iceland. So people in China and medieval Europe really didn't know what was going on. They just saw clouds that came and never left. And the results of these clouds were devastating. And while we don't exactly know how many people died due to the famine and political unrest that were caused by the volcanic winter of 536 AD, this entire situation was basically just rubbing salt in the wounds of what was already happening during the late antiquity period. And I don't want to harp on the late antiquity so much, but let's just kind of recap. consistent wars and raids, famine, economic collapse, a massive bubonic plague pandemic, and on top of all of this, a year and a half where the sky was just darker and everything was colder, which caused people to get really weird and squirrely, food to die, and weather to get weird. Like, for example, in China, it literally snowed during the summertime. Following 536 AD, there was something known as the Late Antique Little Ice Age, which lasted from 536 to 660, because after this 18 months of the initial cloud dust that caused a volcanic winter, there was other eruptions that happened shortly after that prolonged the cooling of the earth at this time. So even though 536 is the year that gets all the fame, there was roughly a 130-year period where the earth was just colder, and it was literally known as a little ice age. Ridiculous. Fast forwarding out of the late antiquity period for the second time, we're now moving on into the mid-1300s when medieval Europe is in full swing, and we are now experiencing one of the most devastating pandemics of all time, the Black Death. In all of Europe, and even areas outside of Europe from 1347 to 1351, basically nobody was safe from one of the deadliest pandemics to ever happen. Now, we've already discussed the bubonic plague that took place during the late antiquity period, but I had to discuss the Black Death because it was so culturally significant and it was so devastating. So I'm going to make this part short, but I had to mention it. During this roughly 4-year period, the Black Death wiped out an estimated 30 to 60% of all of Europe's population, which is almost unfathomable to think about. In numbers, the death toll is estimated to be around 50 million in Europe and up to potentially 200 million globally. Like, let's just say it killed an average of 50% of people in Europe. That means 1 in 2 people were killed by the plague in only a few year period. That is so hard to even imagine. And on top of the sheer terrifying nature of half of the people that were living now dying, there's also massive social and political impacts because of the Black Death, adding gas to the fire of this already out of control situation. And it's for that reason that being alive during the mid-1300s would be one of the worst times to ever be born or live in general, because everybody was terrified of the disease that was going around. Nobody knew how to properly treat or prevent this disease. Half of everybody you know is dying from this disease. And if you were to be born in this setting, it must have seemed like the world was just ending around you. And for that reason, it's more than obvious why you would have not wanted to been born or live during this period of time. And seeing as disease and pandemics are inescapable on this list, I do have another example to discuss. And it takes place during the late 1400s. But this is a time that is specifically tragic for a specific group of people: Native Americans. Europeans decided to take a trip over to America, and it ended in 95% of all indigenous populations effectively being wiped out, because Americans were immune to and carried diseases that the Native Americans have never seen before. But it wasn't only the diseases that made the colonization of the Americas so devastating for the Native Americans, but it was also the social and religious and cultural aspects of the entire colonization by the Europeans. If you were a Native American living anywhere in North America, basically any time after 1492 was a really tragic time to be born and alive. As I mentioned previously, when the Europeans began to colonize Americas, the spread of old world diseases such as smallpox led to one of the deadliest biological disasters basically ever recorded. It's estimated that up to 55 million or 95% of Native Americans passed away just from diseases alone. But that's really where the suffering began. If you were an indigenous person during the time of colonization, not only did you experience the widespread disease, but also widespread violence, displacement, and essentially destruction. The Europeans at this point already had gunpowder, and now they realized that they had an unintentional bioweapon that they could use at will. And because of this, many indigenous groups were simply at the mercy of the Europeans that were colonizing their land, which meant that people were moved out of places that they've lived for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Wars took place on people that were already weak and had low morale, and the entire Native American way of life was not only in jeopardy, but on the verge of being destroyed forever. The settlers and explorers from Europe that were living in the Americas didn't have an easy life either. But compared to what the indigenous people experienced during this time, it's not even comparable. And keep in mind, these European explorers and settlers, they chose to embark on this mission. The Native Americans didn't ask for any of this. They were living their own life until the Europeans inserted themselves and brought over germs and steel. And even to this very day, you can still see the effects of this colonization on Native American communities. The colonization of the Americas is another example of an extremely harsh and tragic transition period that happened throughout history. And for better or for worse, it happened. And to have lived or been born as a Native American during this time, it would have been extremely hard and tragic. And for that reason, I had to put it on this list. And for the last time in this video, I actually wanted to discuss an entire time period. And I saved it for the end because it might not fit the criteria for some people, as this time period is prehistoric. And it's also pre-human. It's known as the Carboniferous period, and it took place from 539 million BC to 299 million BC. And while humans didn't exist during this time period, if you were to have been born in this time period, you would have been wishing you weren't. The Earth was much different hundreds of millions of years ago, with one of the most notable changes being the oxygen level being much higher than it is today. As of right now, the air we breathe is only roughly 21% oxygen, but during the Carboniferous period, the air was 35% oxygen, which sounds great until you remember that oxygen is actually highly flammable, which meant that during this time period where forests were rich and lush, massive forest fires took place and would rage uncontrollably, sometimes for months or years on end. But that's only the start to some of the Carboniferous shenanigans. Because sure, if you were to be born in this time period, the air alone would cause health issues and would likely cause oxygen toxicity over time, but potentially that's something you could acclimate to. Scientists let me know. But forest fires aside, you would have been faced with some of the most devastating and disgusting creatures of all time. Keep in mind, the Carboniferous period is far before the dinosaurs. So if there was no humans and no dinosaurs, what was roaming the earth? And the answer is insects and arthropods. And these creatures thrived in this oxygen-rich environment, which meant that they could grow to insane sizes. That's right, the Carboniferous period was essentially a time when the entire planet was overrun by huge bugs. There was giant dragonflies that had wingspans that were over 2 feet long. And there was over 3.5 foot long millipedes that would just be crawling around. And these are only 2 examples of some of the creatures that existed during this time. This time period is also known as the Golden Age of Sharks, which as a human means that it's definitely not the Golden Age for you, which is just another reason why this entire period of time would be horrible to be a human, or alive as a human for that matter. But in case the prosperity of sharks and giant bugs weren't enough to kind of creep you out, there was also mega arachne, because of course there was. And what that means is there was giant spiders. Spiders that got as big as a human head, which, I mean, I guess comparably to the size of the other animals I discussed isn't that big, but I mean, I don't want to touch any spider, let alone a spider the size of my head. Even though the Carboniferous period likely would have been extremely beautiful with the rich oxygen causing lush rainforests and greenery to thrive globally, due to the residents of the earth at this time, you would have definitely not wanted to experience it. But I'm curious, out of everything I discussed in this video, which time do you think was the absolute worst and why? Let me know in the comments below.